Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be diving in.
So today we're looking at Florida, but maybe not the Florida everyone immediately thinks of.
Right. We're talking about its transformation, how it went from being, well, almost defined by mosquitoes.
Yeah, exactly. To this, massive global tourism destination it is now.
And the key player in that story, public health pest control, often doesn't get the spotlight.
Not at all. We've gathered some really interesting material that lays out this whole journey.
Yeah, and, if you've ever been on vacation in Florida and didn't get eaten alive by mosquitoes, well, there's a reason for that.
Right. It's easy to just take it for granted.
Totally. But it represents, over 100 years of really dedicated work. This isn't just some, minor bug issue.
No, it's fundamentally about how the state overcame this huge natural barrier, which really shaped its entire future.
A key takeaway right off the bat. Sometimes a seemingly small thing, biologically speaking, can hold back so much potential.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to dig into just how bad that mosquito problem really was historically.
Understand those early perceptions of Florida, which weren't always flattering.
Not at all. And then trace the key moments, the strategies that started to turn the tide, leading to effective control.
And ultimately show how tackling this tiny pest had such a massive ripple effect on tourism and development.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story how a nuisance really cast this long shadow and how they finally managed to, get out from under it. Okay, let's kick things off. Just how bad was the mosquito situation early on?
Well, the contrast is pretty stark, isn't it, between now and then?
Definitely.
Our sources really paint this picture of a place just swarming, so much so that people genuinely thought it might be uninhabitable, or at least parts of it.
You mentioned that quote from John Randolph during the statehood debates.
Right. He called it a land of swamps, of quagmires, of frogs and alligators and mosquitoes, basically saying this place is just too wild, too buggy for serious development.
Wow. And the names, the actual place names back then tell that story too, don't they?
They really do. Barro de Mosquitos. That was Ponce de Leon Inlet.
Incredible.
And then you had the Mosquito Country for the area north of Cape Canaveral.
The whole area.
Apparently.
Yeah.
And even Mosquito County, which, as you said, is now Orange County. Think about that. Theme Park Central was once officially Mosquito County.
It's almost hard to picture now.
Exactly. And these names weren't just, colorful descriptions. They reflected a real limitation.
So people couldn't settle just anywhere.
Not easily. For a long time, most settlements were clustered up north. And major cities, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Tallahassee, Pensacola, they were smack in the middle of what was called the malaria belt.
Right, so it wasn't just the nuisance of bites, it was deadly disease.
Absolutely. The sources are pretty clear on the human cost. Summer wasn't just about annoying swarms, it meant potentially fatal fevers.
Yellow fever epidemics,
Yeah.
You mentioned those were devastating.
Yeah, the 1877 one in Jacksonville and Fernandina Beach. The source calls it the state's worst Holocaust.
Good grief.
Huge percentage of the population in Fernandina Beach got sick. Many died. Then more outbreaks in the late 1880s. Jacksonville apparently saw a mass exodus in 1888 because of it.
It's just sobering to think that these tiny insects could inflict that much suffering and societal disruption.
And think about the economy, right? Commerce just couldn't flourish properly.
People would leave if they could afford it.
Yeah. Anyone with means often fled north during the worst seasons, just to escape the mosquitoes and the risk of disease. It paints a picture of a state really struggling.
And that anecdote about the Sanibel Island postman
Oh, that's a classic illustration.
having to dress like an Eskimo in Florida.
Parka, netting, the whole 9 yards apparently,
Yeah.
just to deliver mail because the mosquitoes were that thick.
Yeah.
It really drives home how extreme it could be.
Okay, so clearly a massive problem. How on earth did they start to get a handle on it? Where did organized control begin?
Well, the first real organized pushes came in the early 20th century. The sources point to World War I, specifically at Camp Johnson near Jacksonville.
Military-driven initially.
Primarily, yes. The Army, the U.S. Public Health Service, the State Board of Health, they were focused on preventing malaria among the soldiers.
And what did they do?
The basics, really, but organized. Drainage to eliminate breeding sites and larviciding, killing the larvae in the water before they could become biting adults.
Right. And did that experience kind of spill over into civilian life? You mentioned a project in Perry.
Exactly. That 1919 Project in Perry is significant. It was the first non-military effort in Florida, and apparently one of the biggest control projects in the whole country at that time.
So a sign that people were realizing this needed tackling beyond just the Army bases.
Definitely. It showed this growing awareness that mosquito control was vital for the state's health and, well, its future. It's kind of amazing that those early steps laid the groundwork for, Disney World indirectly.
Huh? Yeah, in a way. But it sounds like the real game changer organizationally was the Florida Anti-Mosquito Association, FAMA, in 1922.
That was definitely a turning point, now the FMCA, of course.
And having the state's first health officer, Dr. Porter, as president must have given it some clout.
Huge amount. FAMA really signaled a move towards a more coordinated, statewide, long-term strategy.
And then came the local districts.
Yep. Following FAMA, you start seeing the first mosquito control districts pop up in individual counties through the 20s and 30s. Indian River, St. Lucie, Broward, Dade.
Showing that local areas were buying in, taking responsibility.
Exactly. A growing recognition that this needed organized, funded effort at the local level.
And interestingly, even the Great Depression played a part, didn't it, with federal programs?
It did. Things like the Civil Works Administration, the WPA, they poured federal money into public works, and a good chunk of that in Florida went to malaria control projects.
Over 1,500 miles of drainage ditches, the source said. That's a lot of digging.
A massive amount. It shows how national crises could, sort of inadvertently, funnel resources into tackling these long-standing regional problems.
And this federal support continued.
Yeah, it ramped up again during World War II. The U.S. Public Health Service created the Bureau of Malaria Control in 1941 and set up specific malaria control in war areas projects near military bases. It was a national security issue again, too.
And then post-war, DDT enters the picture.
Right. There was that DDT residual house spraying program from 1945 to 1949 targeting malarious areas.
Which was effective initially, but obviously, we know now about the significant environmental problems with DDT later on.
Absolutely. It was seen as a kind of miracle weapon at first, and it definitely knocked back mosquito populations and disease transmission in the short term. But the long-term ecological costs became very apparent down the line.
So with all these combined efforts, drainage, larviciding, organization, DDT for a time, what was the overall impact on Florida's growth?
Well, the connection seems really direct, especially for coastal development. All that work, particularly the ditching and impounding of the salt marshes, literally made land habitable that wasn't before.
Because those marshes were prime mosquito breeding grounds.
Exactly. Especially for the really aggressive salt marsh mosquitoes. Once those areas were under better control, you could actually build houses, resorts. You could develop the coastline.
And that ties directly into tourism.
Massively. The source specifically points out how controlling those salt marsh species like Aedes taeniorhynchus was critical for the tourist industry to take off.
People could actually go to the beach without being relentlessly attacked.
Pretty much. It removed a huge barrier to enjoying Florida's main natural attraction, its coast. These projects weren't just about stopping malaria. They fundamentally enabled the kind of development that fuels tourism.
And there's data backing this up. You mentioned a figure 2 in the source.
Yeah, it apparently shows a graph plotting the decline in that specific mosquito species against the rise in tourism income. It's a pretty striking visual correlation. It really highlights this idea.
Yeah.
Managing pests effectively isn't just a health issue. It can be a massive economic driver.
Absolutely. When you think about Florida now, this global powerhouse for tourism, and contrast it with those early descriptions.
Swamps and mosquitoes.
Right. The transformation is just incredible, and pest control was right at the heart of it.
It really underscores the power of sustained public health efforts.
So we know the history and the impact, but let's talk about the mosquitoes themselves for a minute. What makes them so challenging to control, even now?
Well, part of it is just their incredible adaptability. Mosquitoes are everywhere, worldwide.
And they breed in all sorts of places, right?
Almost anywhere. They're standing water for, a week or so. Pond edges, marshes, rain barrels, gutters, old tires, tree holes, even tiny amounts in certain plants or things like crab holes on the coast.
So a huge variety of habitats.
Huge variety. And then their egg laying is different too. Some lay single eggs on damp soil waiting for rain. Others lay clusters, called rafts, directly on the water surface.
Okay.
Their flight ranges vary. How they survive winter varies. Some as eggs, some as larvae underwater, some as hibernating adults. All these differences between species make control really complex.
Because what works for one type might totally miss another.
Precisely. You can't just have a single one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
You need to know which species you're dealing with, where they breed, when they're active, how they survive.
And there are loads of species.
Thousands worldwide, over 3,000 described.
Yeah.
And even just in Florida, you're looking at around 80 different species.
80. Wow. Okay, that definitely highlights the challenge. You need really tailored, knowledgeable control programs.
Exactly. It requires ongoing surveillance and specific strategies based on the local mosquito populations.
Okay, let's maybe do a quick recap then. We've covered a lot of ground, from the early struggles to the modern day. What was that initial perception of Florida again?
Summed up by that Randolph quote, basically. Swampy, buggy, disease-prone, maybe not worth developing. Mosquitoes were a defining negative feature.
And the key turning points in control.
We talked about those first organized efforts during WWI.
Right, near military bases.
The Perry Project, showing civilian potential. The huge step of forming FAMA in 1922.
The start of real coordination.
The establishment of local districts, and then the big boost from federal funding during the Depression and WWII, plus the introduction, for a time, of DDT.
And the ultimate impact of all that,
It fundamentally enabled coastal development by making those areas livable.
which paved the way for.
The massive growth of Florida's tourism industry. A direct line from mosquito control to economic prosperity and a better quality of life.
But as we just touched on, it's not job done, is it?
No, absolutely not. Because of that biological diversity and adaptability we talked about, mosquito control has to be a continuous, ongoing effort.
Adapting strategies as needed.
Constantly. Vigilance, surveillance, using integrated methods. It's essential to maintain the progress that's been made.
Okay, so maybe a final thought for our listeners to take away.
Well, perhaps the next time you're in Florida, maybe enjoying a beach or an attraction, just take a second.
Appreciate the lack of swarms.
Yeah. Appreciate that comfortable experience is actually the result of this century-long battle against a tiny insect. It's a really powerful example, I think.
How tackling a seemingly small environmental challenge, but doing it with persistence and ingenuity, can totally reshape a place and its future.
Makes you wonder what other big challenges could be tackled with that same kind of focused effort.
That's a great point. And if this deep dive has got you thinking,
Maybe look into what's happening now in pest control, the current tech, the methods, or explore how other regions have dealt with similar public health or environmental challenges.
there's always more to learn, right? From past successes and failures, too, and how we manage our environment and our health.
Absolutely. Lots to think about.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a bit of a journey through Florida's history.
But maybe not the usual history, right?
Exactly. Not beaches or theme parks, but bugs. Specifically, we're tracing how the state has, organized itself over time to deal with insects and other arthropods, the ones that impact our health, and of course, agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as your quick guide to understanding why Florida's bug management system looks the way it does today. You get a real sense of the foundation.
Yeah, and it's interesting how looking at something like insect control can really tell you a lot about a state's priorities.
Yeah.
Balancing public health, agriculture, that whole picture.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've dug into old state laws, records of organizational changes within the government, really trying to pull out the key moments.
Turning points.
Yeah, the turning points. Our mission really is to uncover those key decisions, the structural shifts that shaped Florida's fight against these, tiny but incredibly important creatures.
So where do we start this story?
Okay, let's dive right in. It might seem a bit random, but 1946 is a key year. That's when the Bureau of Malaria Control was abolished.
Right. And for listeners, that might just sound like an old government name, but it's actually a really significant starting point.
Why is that? What did abolishing it signal?
Well, it wasn't about giving up on fighting disease, not at all. It signaled a shift, a broadening of focus. Just tackling malaria wasn't enough. There were other insect-borne diseases, nuisance pests, things that needed a wider lens. So this move, it really paves the way for a more comprehensive approach. What we now think of as public health entomology.
Gotcha. And that broader approach, it took shape pretty quickly, right? Same year, 1946.
Exactly. The Division of Entomology was created.
And interestingly, it was put inside the Bureau of Sanitary Engineering.
Yeah, which tells you something about how they viewed the problem initially.
How so?
Well, placing entomology within sanitary engineering, it really frames it as a kind of public health engineering challenge back then, managing the environment, drainage, sanitation, practical engineering type solutions to stop disease vectors.
Makes sense. But this division, it didn't stay put for too long.
No, it climbed the ladder, so to speak.
By 1953, it got a promotion, became the Bureau of Entomology. That seems like a pretty quick elevation, organizationally speaking.
It does. And that step up likely reflected a growing awareness, I think. Insects weren't just about transmitting diseases, right?
Right.
They affect agriculture, tourism, just our general quality of life. So giving entomology its own bureau status probably signaled that the state recognized its wider importance.
Okay, so the importance grows, then things keep evolving. 1976 rolls around.
And the bureau becomes the Office of Entomology.
Then another decade, 1986, it gets integrated into a bigger department, the Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services as Entomology Services. These administrative shuffles, the name changes, what do they usually mean? Are they just moving boxes around on an org chart?
Sometimes it might feel like that, but usually they reflect evolving ideas about where a function best fits. That move into health and rehabilitative services in '86, for instance, really cemented the link between insect control and public health within the state structure at that time.
At that time, right, because the story doesn't stop there. There's another big move.
Indeed. In 1992, a pretty significant shift happens.
The whole program moves over to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, DCS, and it gets its current name, the Bureau of Scientific Evaluation and Technical Assistance, BSSET.
Right, BCM.
So why the move to agriculture? What's the big takeaway there?
Well, that final move, landing in days, it really signals a kind of mature understanding, I'd say. Arthropod control isn't just public health, it's also critical for protecting Florida's huge agricultural sector.
Okay, so it reflects that dual role.
Exactly. And the current functions of BSETA show that. Scientific evaluation, testing new pesticides, methods, technical assistance, advising farmers, mosquito control districts, and crucially, they still administer state funds for non-agricultural arthropod control.
So they haven't lost the public health side.
Not at all. They still advise those mosquito control districts, which are so important.
And those districts, they actually go way back too, don't they? Florida was kind of head of the game there.
Oh, absolutely. Very early on. Laws in 1925, 1929, 1941, these allowed local communities to set up their own self-taxing mosquito control districts.
Self-taxing, that's key, isn't it? Local funding for local problems.
It really is. It showed real foresight. Mosquito control often works best locally, and giving districts the power to tax themselves provided a dedicated, sustainable funding source right where it was needed.
But the state didn't just say, okay, you're on your own. They stepped in with support too.
Yes, that came a bit later. In 1949, a state law introduced direct state aid.
What kind of aid?
Things like insecticides, materials, equipment, even personnel and vehicles. A significant boost for those local districts.
Yeah, I bet. Especially for smaller ones.
Definitely. That 49 law was a real game changer. It showed the state stepping up, acknowledging its role in supporting local efforts, providing resources they might not afford otherwise. It really amplified what they could do.
And then they followed that up just a few years later, 1953, with another state aid law.
They did. This one was more about financial incentives, specifically matching funds.
Matching funds. How did that work?
Well, the state offered to match funds up to a pretty generous 75% for counties or districts that budgeted for controlling arthropods of public health importance. And there was a specific emphasis on funding permanent control measures.
Permanent control. Like fixing drainage issues instead of just spraying.
Exactly. Things like source reduction, modifying habitats, long-term solutions. There were also additional matching funds for temporary or permanent control too, but that focus on permanent measures was strategic.
How so?
By offering that big 75% match, the state really incentivized locals to invest in sustainable, long-term fixes, not just constantly reacting with temporary spraying. It pushed towards more effective, lasting control.
And that basic idea still exists today.
Pretty much. The system has evolved, of course, but the principle of state funds being available, contingent on DCS approval, is still there. The details are in the Florida Administrative Code now, Chapter 5E 2.030, I believe. It shows the durability of that legislative approach.
So we've got the organization evolving, the local districts, the state funding. But what about the science, the research?
Yes. Florida also recognized early on that you need dedicated research. In 1953, the same year as that second aid law, the legislature put money aside to establish the Entomological Research Center down in Vero Beach.
Vero Beach.
It was officially dedicated in 1956, and apparently it became quite famous. The text says, world-renowned.
World-renowned, wow. What made it so special?
It was a clear statement. Research is fundamental. Its reputation likely came from having top-notch facilities and doing groundbreaking work on the biology, the ecology, the control methods for all sorts of arthropods affecting health.
And it eventually got a new name.
Yes, in 1973, it was renamed the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory, or FMAL, really highlighting that public health focus. And later, in 1979, it became part of the University of Florida, IFAS.
IFAS, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Okay.
Yeah. So it transitioned into the university system, but kept that vital research mission.
And Vero Beach wasn't the only research hub created.
Correct. Up in the Panhandle, in Panama City, the West Florida Arthropod Research Laboratory was set up in 1963.
West Florida Lab. What was its main focus?
Its primary mission was tackling a very specific regional pest, the dogfly.
The dogfly.
Also known as the stable fly, Simoxis calcitrans. Anyone who's spent time on the Gulf Coast, especially late summer, early fall, knows how bad they can be.
Oh, right. Those biting flies near the beaches. Nasty.
Exactly. So that lab focused on studying and controlling them, and also on testing insecticide effectiveness against mosquitoes and other arthropods relevant to that area.
So a very targeted mission for that lab.
Very much so. It showed the state paying attention to specific regional problems that might impact tourism or local life. That lab also eventually moved under a university umbrella.
Which one?
In 1992, it was transferred to Florida A&M University, MMU, as part of their College of Engineering Sciences, Technology, and Agriculture. And it was renamed the John A. Mulrennan Senior Public Health Entomology Research and Education Center, or JAMS-FAERC.
Okay, quite a name, but the mission continued.
Yes. The core mission of research and education on arthropod control relevant to the region carried on.
All right, so let's just quickly pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's quite an evolution.
Yeah, we saw this progression, right? From focusing just on malaria to a broader entomology view. We saw the main state entity change names, move departments, finally landing in agriculture.
Reflecting that dual health and agricultural importance.
Then we saw the very early creation of local self-funded mosquito districts.
Super important foundational step.
Followed by significant state financial aid and incentives.
Right. Providing resources and nudging towards long-term solutions.
And finally, the establishment of these dedicated research centers, Vero Beach and Panama City, with their own specific expert areas.
Yeah, creating the scientific backbone.
It really paints a picture of a state deliberately building up its infrastructure layer by layer to deal with arthropods.
Absolutely. It reveals a state that's adapted its approach over time, recognizing how complex these issues are, linking public health, the economy, the environment.
Okay, great overview. Now let's nail down a few key points with some questions just to make sure we've all got it straight. Ready?
Let's do it.
Question 1. Thinking back to the mid-20th century, what was that initial state-level group focused on insect-borne disease, and what was the main reason it got restructured?
Okay, the initial one was the Bureau of Malaria Control. And the key reason for restructuring, for basically abolishing it and starting something new, was the realization that Florida needed a broader approach. Not just malaria, but other insect diseases, nuisance pests. A wider view of entomology was necessary.
Perfect. Okay, question 2. Can you quickly outline 2 main ways the state government has financially helped local arthropod control efforts?
Sure. 2 main ways. First, way back in the 20s and 40s, passing laws that let local areas create their own self-taxing mosquito control districts, so empowering local funding.
Got it. And the second?
Second was direct state aid. Specifically, you had the 1949 law giving resources like insecticides, equipment, and then the 1953 law offering those matching funds, especially encouraging investment in permanent control measures for public health arthropods.
Excellent summary. All right, last one, question 3. We talked about those 2 main research centers. What were their original affiliations, sort of who set them up initially and where are they now? And what was their main research focus right at the start?
Okay, let's see. The one in Vero Beach, originally the Entomological Research Center, was set up directly by the state legislature. Now, it's the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory, FMAL, and it's part of the University of Florida's IFAS. Its initial focus was pretty broad biology and control of arthropods important to public health generally.
Okay, and the one in Panama City?
That one started as the West Florida Arthropod Research Laboratory, also established by the state. Now, it's the John A. Mulrennan Senior Center, the JAMS-FAERC, and it's part of Florida A&M University. His primary initial focus was much more specific, that dogfly, the stable fly, plus testing insecticide effectiveness in that region.
Fantastic. Great recall.
Trying to keep it straight.
So hopefully listening to this, you now have a much clearer picture of how Florida built up its system for managing insects and arthropods over the decades. It's really a story of adaptation, investment, and just a growing understanding of how much these tiny things matter.
Yeah, knowing this history really gives you context for today's practices.
Okay.
You see the long-term commitment.
Definitely. And that leads us nicely into our final thought for you to chew on. Considering this whole evolution we've discussed, the organizational changes, the funding models, the research focus, what do you think are the biggest challenges Florida might face next in arthropod control?
Ooh, good question. Things like climate change, maybe? Insecticide resistance? New invasive species arriving?
Exactly. All those factors. And how might the structures and the knowledge that Florida has built up over the last, 70, 80 years, help it adapt and innovate for whatever comes next?
Definitely something to think about. How does this foundation prepare them for the future?
It is. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Florida's entomological history.
My pleasure. Fascinating stuff.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a bit of a journey through Florida's history.
But maybe not the usual history, right?
Exactly. Not beaches or theme parks, but bugs. Specifically, we're tracing how the state has, organized itself over time to deal with insects and other arthropods, the ones that impact our health, and of course, agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as your quick guide to understanding why Florida's bug management system looks the way it does today. You get a real sense of the foundation.
Yeah, and it's interesting how looking at something like insect control can really tell you a lot about a state's priorities.
Yeah.
Balancing public health, agriculture, that whole picture.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've dug into old state laws, records of organizational changes within the government, really trying to pull out the key moments.
Turning points.
Yeah, the turning points. Our mission really is to uncover those key decisions, the structural shifts that shaped Florida's fight against these, tiny but incredibly important creatures.
So where do we start this story?
Okay, let's dive right in. It might seem a bit random, but 1946 is a key year. That's when the Bureau of Malaria Control was abolished.
Right. And for listeners, that might just sound like an old government name, but it's actually a really significant starting point.
Why is that? What did abolishing it signal?
Well, it wasn't about giving up on fighting disease, not at all. It signaled a shift, a broadening of focus. Just tackling malaria wasn't enough. There were other insect-borne diseases, nuisance pests, things that needed a wider lens. So this move, it really paves the way for a more comprehensive approach. What we now think of as public health entomology.
Gotcha. And that broader approach, it took shape pretty quickly, right? Same year, 1946.
Exactly. The Division of Entomology was created.
And interestingly, it was put inside the Bureau of Sanitary Engineering.
Yeah, which tells you something about how they viewed the problem initially.
How so?
Well, placing entomology within sanitary engineering, it really frames it as a kind of public health engineering challenge back then, managing the environment, drainage, sanitation practical, engineering-type solutions to stop disease vectors.
Makes sense. But this division, it didn't stay put for too long.
No, it climbed the ladder, so to speak.
By 1953, it got a promotion, became the Bureau of Entomology. That seems like a pretty quick elevation, organizationally speaking.
It does. And that step up likely reflected a growing awareness, I think. Insects weren't just about transmitting diseases, right?
Right.
They affect agriculture, tourism, just our general quality of life. So giving entomology its own bureau status probably signaled that the state recognized its wider importance.
Okay, so the importance grows, then things keep evolving. 1976 rolls around.
And the bureau becomes the Office of Entomology.
Then another decade, 1986, it gets integrated into a bigger department, the Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services as Entomology Services. These administrative shuffles, the name changes, what do they usually mean? Are they just moving boxes around on an org chart?
Sometimes it might feel like that, but usually they reflect evolving ideas about where a function best fits. That move into health and rehabilitative services in '86, for instance, really cemented the link between insect control and public health within the state structure at that time.
At that time, right, because the story doesn't stop there. There's another big move.
Indeed. In 1992, a pretty significant shift happens.
The whole program moves over to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, DCS, and it gets its current name, the Bureau of Scientific Evaluation and Technical Assistance, BSSET?
Right, BCM.
So why the move to agriculture? What's the big takeaway there?
Well, that final move, landing in days, It really signals a kind of mature understanding, I'd say. Arthropod control isn't just public health, it's also critical for protecting Florida's huge agricultural sector.
Ah, okay. So it reflects that dual role.
Exactly. And the current functions of BSETA show that.
Huh.
Scientific evaluation, testing new pesticides, methods, technical assistance, advising farmers, mosquito control districts, and crucially, they still administer state funds for non-agricultural arthropod control.
So they haven't lost the public health side.
Not at all. They still advise those mosquito control districts, which are so important.
And those districts, they actually go way back too, don't they? Florida was kind of head of the game there.
Oh, absolutely. Very early on. Laws in 1925, 1929, 1941. These allowed local communities to set up their own self-taxing mosquito control districts.
Self-taxing, that's key, isn't it? Local funding for local problems.
It really is. It showed real foresight. Mosquito control often works best locally, and giving districts the power to tax themselves provided a dedicated, sustainable funding source right where it was needed.
But the state didn't just say, okay, you're on your own. They stepped in with support too.
Yes, that came a bit later. In 1949, a state law introduced direct state aid.
What kind of aid?
Things like insecticides, materials, equipment, even personnel and vehicles. A significant boost for those local districts.
Yeah, I bet. Especially for smaller ones.
Definitely. That 49 law was a real game changer. It showed the state stepping up, acknowledging its role in supporting local efforts, providing resources they might not afford otherwise. It really amplified what they could do.
And then they followed that up just a few years later, 1953, with another state aid law.
They did. This one was more about financial incentives, specifically matching funds.
Matching funds. How did that work?
Well, the state offered to match funds up to a pretty generous 75% for counties or districts that budgeted for controlling arthropods of public health importance. And there was a specific emphasis on funding permanent control measures.
Permanent control. Like fixing drainage issues instead of just spraying.
Exactly. Things like source reduction, modifying habitats, long-term solutions. There were also additional matching funds for temporary or permanent control too, but that focus on permanent measures was strategic.
How so?
By offering that big 75% match, the state really incentivized locals to invest in sustainable, long-term fixes, not just constantly reacting with temporary spraying. It pushed towards more effective, lasting control.
And that basic idea still exists today.
Pretty much. The system has evolved, of course, but the principle of state funds being available, contingent on DECI's approval, is still there. The details are in the Florida Administrative Code now, Chapter 5E 2.030, I believe. It shows the durability of that legislative approach.
So we've got the organization evolving, the local districts, the state funding. But what about the science, the research?
Ah, yes. Florida also recognized early on that you need dedicated research. In 1953, the same year as that second aid law, the legislature put money aside to establish the Entomological Research Center down in Vero Beach.
Vero Beach.
It was officially dedicated in 1956, and apparently it became quite famous. The text says, world-renowned.
World-renowned. Wow. What made it so special?
It was a clear statement. Research is fundamental. Its reputation likely came from having top-notch facilities and doing groundbreaking work on the biology, the ecology, the control methods for all sorts of arthropods affecting health.
And it eventually got a new name.
Yes, in 1973, it was renamed the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory, or FMAL, really highlighting that public health focus. And later, in 1979, it became part of the University of Florida, IFAS.
IFAS, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Okay.
Yeah. So it transitioned into the university system, but kept that vital research mission.
And Vero Beach wasn't the only research hub created.
Correct. Up in the Panhandle, in Panama City, the West Florida Arthropod Research Laboratory was set up in 1963.
West Florida Lab. What was its main focus?
Its primary mission was tackling a very specific regional pest, the dogfly.
The dogfly.
Also known as the stable fly, Simoxis calcitrans. Anyone who's spent time on the Gulf Coast, especially late summer, early fall, knows how bad they can be.
Oh, right. Those biting flies near the beaches. Nasty.
Exactly. So that lab focused on studying and controlling them, and also on testing insecticide effectiveness against mosquitoes and other arthropods relevant to that area.
So a very targeted mission for that lab.
Very much so. It showed the state paying attention to specific regional problems that might impact tourism or local life. That lab also eventually moved under a university umbrella.
Which one?
In 1992, it was transferred to Florida A&M University, MMU, as part of their College of Engineering Sciences, Technology, and Agriculture. And it was renamed the John A. Mulrennan Senior Public Health Entomology Research and Education Center, or JAMS-FAERC.
Okay, quite a name, but the mission continued.
Yes, the core mission of research and education on arthropod control relevant to the region carried on.
All right, so let's just quickly pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's quite an evolution.
Yeah, we saw this progression, right? From focusing just on malaria to a broader entomology view. We saw the main state entity change names, move departments, finally landing in agriculture.
Reflecting that dual health and agricultural importance.
Then we saw the very early creation of local self-funded mosquito districts,
Super important foundational step.
followed by significant state financial aid and incentives.
Right. Providing resources and nudging towards long-term solutions.
And finally, the establishment of these dedicated research centers, Vero Beach and Panama City, with their own specific expert areas.
Yeah, creating the scientific backbone.
It really paints a picture of a state deliberately building up its infrastructure layer by layer to deal with arthropods.
Absolutely. It reveals a state that's adapted its approach over time, recognizing how complex these issues are, linking public health, the economy, the environment.
Okay, great overview. Now let's nail down a few key points with some questions just to make sure we've all got it straight. Ready?
Let's do it.
Question 1. Thinking back to the mid-20th century, what was that initial state-level group focused on insect-borne disease, and what was the main reason it got restructured?
Okay, the initial one was the Bureau of Malaria Control. And the key reason for restructuring, for basically abolishing it and starting something new, was the realization that Florida needed a broader approach. Not just malaria, but other insect diseases, nuisance pests. A wider view of entomology was necessary.
Perfect. Okay, question 2. Can you quickly outline 2 main ways the state government has financially helped local arthropod control efforts?
Sure. 2 main ways. First, way back in the 20s and 40s, passing laws that let local areas create their own self-taxing mosquito control districts, so empowering local funding.
Got it. And the second?
Second was direct state aid. Specifically, you had the 1949 law giving resources like insecticides, equipment, and then the 1953 law offering those matching funds, especially encouraging investment in permanent control measures for public health arthropods.
Excellent summary. All right, last one, question 3. We talked about those 2 main research centers. What were their original affiliations, sort of who set them up initially and where are they now? And what was their main research focus right at the start?
Okay, let's see. The one in Vero Beach, originally the Entomological Research Center, was set up directly by the state legislature. Now, it's the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory, FMAL, and it's part of the University of Florida's IFAS. Its initial focus was pretty broad biology and control of arthropods important to public health generally.
Okay, and the one in Panama City?
That one started as the West Florida Arthropod Research Laboratory, also established by the state. Now, it's the John A. Mulrennan Senior Center, the JAMS-FAERC, and it's part of Florida A&M University. His primary initial focus was much more specific, that dogfly, the stable fly, plus testing insecticide effectiveness in that region.
Fantastic. Great recall.
Trying to keep it straight.
So hopefully listening to this, you now have a much clearer picture of how Florida built up its system for managing insects and arthropods over the decades. It's really a story of adaptation, investment, and just a growing understanding of how much these tiny things matter.
Yeah, knowing this history really gives you context for today's practices.
Okay.
You see the long-term commitment.
Definitely. And that leads us nicely into our final thought for you to chew on. Considering this whole evolution we've discussed, the organizational changes, the funding models, the research focus, what do you think are the biggest challenges Florida might face next in arthropod control?
Ooh, good question. Things like climate change, maybe? Insecticide resistance? New invasive species arriving?
Exactly. All those factors. And how might the structures and the knowledge that Florida has built up over the last, 70, 80 years, help it adapt and innovate for whatever comes next?
Definitely something to think about. How does this foundation prepare them for the future?
It is. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Florida's entomological history.
My pleasure. Fascinating stuff.
You know that feeling, right? Staring at a huge pile of notes, maybe for a big exam, thinking, how am I going to remember all this stuff? We've all been there, just trying to find those key points that actually stick. Well, today, that's kind of what we're doing. But instead of getting overwhelmed, we're going to really focus in. Our subject today might seem small, but believe me, its impact is massive. We're talking about mosquitoes. Think of this whole deep dive as your ultimate study guide for understanding these, fascinating and often really frustrating creatures.
Exactly. We're working from some specific materials here, excerpts from a document called Mosquitoes, Recognition, Classification, and Health Impacts. And our mission, like you said, is to pull out the absolutely crucial bits. By the end, you should have a really clear, solid understanding, the kind of core knowledge you can rely on, just like when you're prepping for that test.
Okay, perfect. So for anyone who's ever, swatted at something buzzing nearby and thought, wait, was that one? What are the dead giveaways? What makes a mosquito a mosquito?
Right, well, the document points to some key features. You're looking for an insect with a long, slender kind of body and narrow wings. If you could look closely at those wings, you'd see a fringe of tiny scales along the back image, plus veins running through them, and the legs, very long, very thin, almost delicate looking. Those are your main mosquito markers.
Got it. Slender body, fringed wings, long legs. And it's the females we really notice, right? Because they're the ones that bite. Is that always true?
That's generally right, yes. The female has this specialized mouth part. It's called the proboscis. Long, firm, perfect for piercing skin and drawing blood. She needs that blood, specifically the protein in it, to develop her eggs. Now, the males, they have a different setup. They feed only on nectar from flowers to get energy. But, and this is important, both males and females actually need nectar for fuel, for flying around and just, living.
Oh, interesting. So even the biting females need a sugar fix, too.
Okay.
So they don't just, pop into existence as adults. What's their life story? The stages.
Right, it's a full transformation, what scientists call complete metamorphosis. There are 4 distinct stages. Starts with the egg. Then that hatches into a larva. People often call them wrigglers because they, wriggle in the water. Then the larva changes into a pupa, sometimes called a tumbler. And from that pupa emerges the winged adult, the one we all recognize.
Egg, larva, pupa, adult. Got it. Okay, the eggs. Where do they lay them? I always hear standing water, but is it just any standing water?
It's actually quite varied, which is part of why they're so successful. Some species lay eggs one by one, just floating on the water surface. Others group them together into these little rafts. Pretty neat, actually. Then you've got species that lay eggs on the sides of containers, like bird baths or buckets above the current water line. They're anticipating rain. And some even lay them on damp soil, just waiting for the area to flood.
Wow, okay. They're really planning ahead. That makes control tricky, I guess.
Exactly. You get rid of a puddle, but another species might be using a patch of damp ground or the inside edge of a flower pot. Very adaptable.
So after hatching, we've got the larvae, the wrigglers. What's their life like in the water? What are they up to?
They're mostly filter feeders. They eat tiny bits of plants and microscopic animals floating in the water. And they grow, shedding their skin 4 times. Each growth stage between sheds is called an instar. So you have the first instar larva, second, third, and fourth. It's a key thing to know for, say, timing control measures. Knowing which instar they're in tells you how close they are to becoming pupa.
4 instars, okay. And breathing, they're underwater. How does that work? Do they have little gills?
Most don't have gills like fish. The majority have a sort of snorkel, a siphon tube at their tail end. They stick that up through the water surface to breathe air. But there are some exceptions, really interesting ones, actually. The larvae of Mansonia and Cuculicidia mosquitoes, they have this sharp-pointed siphon. They actually pierce the underwater stems or roots of aquatic plants like water lettuce or hyacinth. And they draw oxygen directly from the plant tissues. It's like they've evolved their own scuba tank system using plants.
That is incredible. Okay, so larva becomes pupa, the tumbler. What's this stage about? Is it just waiting?
It's a transformation stage. It's pretty short, and they don't feed as pupa. They're still in the water, though. And they are active. If you disturb the water, they'll tumble downwards, hence the name. Inside that pupal case, the larval body is basically reorganizing itself into the adult form. It's a crucial transition point.
And then the big moment. The adult breaks free. How does that work without drowning?
The pupa floats to the surface, its skin splits along the back, and the adult mosquito carefully pulls itself out. It actually rests on the water surface for a little bit, sometimes using the old pupal skin as a sort of raft. Its wings need to inflate with fluid and then dry and harden before it can actually fly away. Then the cycle starts all over.
Okay, so we can spot them. We know the life cycle. Now, the document gets into classification, binomial nomenclature, and all that. Why is that so important, practically speaking?
Well, think about it like organizing a massive library. Classification gives scientists a universal system, a common language, to identify and talk about any organism, including mosquitoes. It groups them based on shared features, from big groups like Kingdom Animalia down to the very specific species. We use that 2-word system, binomial nomenclature. Genus name first, capitalized, then the specific name lowercase, both italicized. like Aedes aegypti. This precision is absolutely vital. If you're studying disease transmission or trying to control a specific pest mosquito, you have to know exactly which species you're dealing with. They can behave very differently.
Right, so it avoids confusion. You need the right label for the right bug. The document uses Anopheles quadrimaculatus as an example. Can you walk us through its filing system, so to speak?
Sure. So Anopheles quadrimaculatus, that's a major malaria vector historically in the southeastern U.S., its classification goes. Kingdom Animalia, obviously. Phylum Arthropoda jointed legs, exoskeleton. Class Insecta, insects. Order Diptera true flies, meaning just one pair of functional wings. Then family Telicidae, that's the mosquito family. Genus Anopheles. And finally, the species name, Anopheles quadrimaculatus. The document also mentions Say after the name. That refers to Thomas Say, the scientist who first described that particular species. It gives credit and context. Seeing that whole lineage helps understand its relationships to other insects.
Okay, that makes sense. Kingdom down to species, and Florida specifically has quite a mosquito collection, apparently.
Well, it certainly does. The document states around 80 different species have been recorded here, across 12 different genera, like Aedes, abbreviated Aedes, or Culex, Cionex. And what's really key, especially for control and disease folks, is that each species tends to have its own preferences. You know, specific places they like to lay eggs, particular animals they prefer to bite, even how far they tend to fly from where they emerged. Plus, they have small physical differences, morphological differences, that experts can use to tell them apart. You really need to know your mosquitoes if you want to manage them effectively.
80 species.
Okay, that explains why you might have different mosquito problems in different parts of the state or even different neighborhoods. So we know what they are, how they live, how scientists name them. Now, the really critical part why they matter so much, especially here in Florida, health and economy. Yes, historically, Florida had major battles with mosquito-borne diseases. Things like malaria, yellow fever, dengue. These were epidemic here at times. Huge public health efforts, mosquito control programs, thankfully mean those diseases are no longer considered endemic, meaning they aren't constantly circulating here anymore.
I sense a but coming. The document says the mosquitoes that can carry those diseases are still around.
That's the crucial point, yes. Anopheles quadrimaculatus, the malaria vector, is still here. Aedes aegypti, the main vector for yellow fever and dengue, is also present in Florida, so the potential is there. If an infected person travels into Florida and gets bitten by the right local mosquito species, that mosquito could then potentially transmit the disease to other people, starting an outbreak. It means we absolutely cannot get complacent about mosquito control or surveillance.
Right, so constant vigilance is key. But the main mosquito-related health worry in Florida today is encephalitis.
That's correct. Primary concern now revolves around various forms of arthropod-borne encephalitis, often just called arboviruses. Several viruses that cause inflammation of the brain, encephalitis, are known to circulate in Florida mosquito populations. The document lists Eastern equine encephalitis, Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis, California encephalitis, and even Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus has been found here.
Let's break this down a bit. Eastern equine encephalitis, EE. That one sounds particularly nasty.
It is arguably the most severe, yes. EE was first noted back in 1831, actually, linked to horse deaths in Massachusetts. The virus itself, EEV, is an alpha virus. Its main cycle in nature happens out in freshwater swamps. It circulates primarily between certain species of wild birds and the specific mosquito, Culiceta melanura. The cycle peaks usually between May and August, so it has this natural home base, this reservoir in the swamps.
Okay, so normally it just stays between those birds and that one mosquito species in the swamp?
Mostly, yes. Culiceta melanura prefers to bite birds, so it doesn't often bite people or horses. But the virus can escape that cycle. It spills over into mammals, including humans, when other types of mosquitoes bite an infected bird and then later bite a human or a horse. We call these bridge vectors.
Ah, the bridge vectors, connecting the swamp cycle to us. Which mosquitoes act as these bridges for EE in Florida?
Several are implicated. The document lists Coquilitidia perturbans, Aedes atlanticus, Culex negropalpus, Culex pincofasciatus, and Aedes sollicitans. These are the ones known to feed on both birds and mammals, so they can pick up the virus from a bird and potentially transmit it.
Okay, and if someone unfortunately gets EE, what does it look like? What are the symptoms?
The severe form often starts very suddenly, high fever, headache, chills, vomiting, and it can progress quickly to more serious neurological symptoms like disorientation, seizures, even coma. It's very serious. The mortality rate is high, around 33% for reported human cases. And many who survive have significant permanent brain damage. It's a key one to remember.
Wow, 33%. That's incredibly high. What's the picture specifically in Florida? Are human cases common?
Thankfully, documented human cases are relatively rare. The document cites 81 cases between 1957 and 2008. However, it's a major issue for horses. Florida typically sees over 70 equine cases each year, and in bad years, that number can jump over 200, with a devastating mortality rate for horses over 90%. Geographically, EEE in Florida is mostly found north of Lake Okeechobee. Think the Panhandle, Lower St. Johns River area, the Green Swamp region.
Is there anything we can do? Vaccines? Prevention?
Good news for horses there is an effective vaccine. Highly recommended for horses in those risk areas. Bad news for us, no human vaccine currently. So for people, prevention is all about avoiding mosquito bites. That means robust mosquito control, using repellents with DET or bicurdin, wearing protective clothing, especially at dawn and dusk, and maybe staying indoors when mosquito activity is highest.
Okay, EE swamp cycle, bridge vectors, severe in humans and horses, no human vaccine. Got it. Let's shift to St. Louis encephalitis, SLE. Where did that one emerge?
SLE got its name because it was first recognized during a big epidemic near St. Louis, Missouri back in 1933. The virus, SLEV, is a flavirus, so different family than EEV. Like EE, it's also maintained in a bird mosquito cycle. Birds are the main amplifiers, especially with Culex species mosquitoes playing a big role.
How does SLE compare to EE in terms of its effect on people?
It's generally quite different. Many, maybe most, SLEV infections in humans cause no symptoms at all. Less than 1% of infected people actually get sick. But when it does cause illness, the severity is strongly linked to age. Older adults are much more likely to develop serious disease. In Florida epidemics, the case fatality rates have varied, maybe 4% to 30%, but almost all the deaths were in people over 50 years old. That's a key demographic difference compared to E.
And for those who survive a serious case, are there lasting effects?
Yes, unfortunately, long-term neurological problems can occur after severe SLE. Things like paralysis, memory issues, problems with motor control.
Florida has seen some major SLE outbreaks historically.
It has. The document mentions significant ones in 59, 61, 62, 77, and 1990. Interestingly, the Tampa Bay area was hit hard in 61 and 62, and that's when they discovered that Culex nigropalpus, a very common mosquito there, was the main vector and hadn't really been implicated before that. Elsewhere in the U.S., it's often other Culex species like Culex cincofasciatus or Culex dorsalis. These outbreaks were major events impacting public health and also the economy, particularly tourism.
Right. Fear of mosquitoes is not good for tourism. Okay, last one on the list. West Nile encephalitis, WNE. This feels like the newcomer.
It absolutely is in this part of the world anyway. WNE first made headlines in the U.S. in 1999 in the New York City area. The belief is it was introduced, likely from the Middle East. The virus itself, West Nile virus or WNV, is another flavivirus like SLEV. It was actually first isolated way back in 1937 in Uganda.
And it spread like wildfire once it got here, didn't it?
It really did. Astonishingly fast. By 2004, just 5 years after detection in New York, it had been found in 48 states. Florida first detected it in the summer of 2001, initially in a dead crow, I believe. We saw our peak of human cases in 2003, with 99 reported. And now it's been found in every single one of Florida's 67 counties.
Wow. What's the transmission cycle? Similar to SLE?
Very similar, yes. It's primarily a mosquito bird cycle. In Florida, the main mosquito vectors are thought to be Culex cincofasciatus and Culex nigropalpus again. One difference from SLE, though, is that WNV can be quite deadly to certain bird species. Crows, jays, hawks, owls, they saw significant die-offs. It's also tough on horses. Florida had over 1,000 equine cases just between 2001 and 2009.
And for humans, what's the risk profile for West Nile?
Peak transmission in Florida tends to be July through September. Again, like SLE, people over 50 seem to be at the highest risk for severe disease. But the vast majority of infections, maybe 80%, cause no symptoms at all. About 20% get mild, flu-like symptoms, fever, fatigue. It's less than 1% who develop the serious neuroinvasive illness, where the virus affects the brain or spinal cord. Symptoms usually show up 3 to 14 days after the bite. Fatality rates nationally for the neuroinvasive form are around 2-5%. In Florida specifically, it's been about 4% overall, but 7% for those with the neuroinvasive disease.
Okay, so EE, SLE, WNE, all serious, all present in Florida, but with different characteristics, different vectors, different risk groups. It really highlights the need for specific knowledge. And Florida does try to stay ahead of this, right? The document mentions a surveillance program. What does that involve?
Yes, it's a crucial effort started back in the early 70s to try and prevent major epidemics. It's quite comprehensive. They track horse encephalitis cases statewide, They test blood from wild birds and also from flocks of sentinel chickens placed strategically around the state. These chickens act like early warnings if they develop antibodies. It means the virus is active nearby. They also test small mammals and monitor reports of human central nervous system diseases from hospitals. And importantly, they actively collect and test mosquitoes during the summer and fall to see if they're carrying any of these viruses.
So sentinel chickens, bird blood, mosquito testing, a whole network trying to detect these viruses early.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach to get ahead of potential outbreaks and guide control efforts effectively.
It really is fascinating peeling back the layers. We've gone from identifying a mosquito, the slender body, fringed wings through its whole life cycle, the wrigglers and tumblers, now how scientists meticulously classify them, and then the really critical health impacts, especially these different encephalitids, EE, SLE, WNE. It feels like we've built a really solid base of knowledge here. Hitting all the key points you'd need if this were an exam topic.
I think so too. Understanding these basics, identification, life cycle, the diseases, the vectors, it's fundamental not just for general knowledge, but for appreciating the risks and why ongoing surveillance and control are so incredibly important.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder, what else influences these outbreaks? We talked about bridge vectors and reservoirs, but what about climate or land use changes? How might those shift the patterns in the future? And what other mosquito-borne surprises might be out there? It's a dynamic situation, that's for sure. Something to keep thinking about.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting in something that's definitely buzzing around Florida.
Yeah, nice one. Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes, exactly. Specifically, the different species here in Florida, and crucially, where they like to, breed, set up their nurseries.
Yeah.
We've gone through some pretty detailed documents looking at their characteristics, their habitats, really trying to pull out the essentials.
Right.
So if you're maybe prepping for an exam or you just want that quick, clear picture of Florida's mosquito situation, this should help. Our mission today is basically to map out the key players, the species, and their favorite breeding spots.
Yeah.
The kind of info that helps understand their whole life cycle and ecology.
Exactly. And, the first thing to grasp is that Florida has around 80 mosquito species. It's not just one monolithic pest.
80? Wow.
Yeah, roughly. And each one is kind of its own character. For exam purposes, you definitely need to remember they have unique physical traits, different temperature needs for development, and distinct habits, like where they lay eggs, who they prefer to bite.
Yeah.
Understanding those specifics is, it's key to knowing where you'll likely run into them.
Okay, so a quick study point then. It's not just about swatting them. Each species has its own little blueprint.
Pretty much.
How it looks, how its body works, its behavior patterns, where the female lays her eggs, how far it typically flies, even what it likes to feed on could be animals, sometimes even plants for some aspects.
Right. So the blood meal is usually animals for the females that bite. And temperatures, that's fascinating and really important for population dynamics.
Yes.
Each species has a temperature window it prefers.
Yeah.
There's a minimum, a maximum, and then an optimum where they develop fastest.
Right.
And if you get longer periods of those ideal temperatures, you get more generations of mosquitoes popping up in a year. That's a huge point for understanding seasonal peaks.
That makes sense. It explains why Florida's warmth is such a breeding ground, literally. The material we looked at mentioned that, most species peak in summer, but there are exceptions. Some, like Anopheles punctapenis, Culex restuans, Culex salinarius, they actually peak in late spring.
Yeah, and can even breed year-round in some places. That's definitely a key exception to flag for any exam.
Good point. And Florida isn't all the same either.
No, definitely not.
North Florida gets colder in winter, which knocks back the populations of many species.
Right. Too cold for them.
But South Florida, surprisingly, also sees a winter dip, but it's because of less rain, fewer breeding sites.
Exactly. So temperature limits them up north in winter. Lack of water limits them down south, creates these regional patterns.
So out of those 80-ish species, about 36 are like the Florida regulars.
Yeah.
Found everywhere.
Yeah, something like that. Statewide distribution. The others have more limited ranges. Maybe they come down from the southeast U.S. into the Panhandle, or maybe just into central Florida.
Okay.
And here's something really useful, especially thinking about the state's diversity. There's a sort of dividing line for the tropical species.
Oh, interesting. Where's that?
It runs roughly from Punta Gorda across to Lake Okeechobee, and then kind of hooks north through Brevard County.
Gotcha.
Most of the really tropical types stay south of that line. Some are super localized, like only in South Dade or the Keys. Knowing that general geographic split, that helps narrow down which species you might expect to find where. Good exam knowledge.
Okay, great overview of the mosquitoes themselves.
Yeah.
Now let's zoom in on the where. Where are they actually breeding?
Right, the habitats.
The sources really highlighted Florida's naturally poor drainage areas, those mucky, marshy, waterlogged soils.
Oh, yeah, prime real estate.
And the grassy edges of lakes, too. Big breeding grounds.
And a key thing to remember is they generally like still water, quiet water, not fast-flowing streams.
Right. Avoid the rapids.
Exactly. And these watery habitats, they vary a lot. Acidity, alkalinity, freshwater, saltwater, brackish.
Natural versus man-made.
Like a swamp versus a ditch. And then the plants matter. How much? What type? Sun or shade? All these factors influence which species feel at home there.
It's like they have very specific Zillow filters.
Kind of, yeah. And the material really stresses this, where a female mosquito decides to lay her eggs, her ovipositing habit, that directly determines the kind of watery nursery you'll find the larvae in.
Makes sense. The mom chooses the spot.
Precisely. So maybe we should break down the main types of habitats, focusing on those key species for each one. That's the stuff you'd want to know for an exam.
Perfect.
Okay.
Let's start with the salty stuff. Saltwater or blackish environments.
Good place to start. First up, mangrove swamps.
Okay.
The heaviest breeding there is often in that zone just above the normal high tide where the mangrove roots and plants hold moisture.
Ah, that transitional zone.
Exactly. They lay eggs on the sloping sides of little potholes, ditches within the swamp, sometimes even flat grassy spots. And some need that cycle of flooding and drying for the eggs to hatch.
Okay, key species for mangroves.
For exam purposes, associate mangroves with Aedes tenuricus, Aedes sollicitans, Anopheles atrepos, and Culex nigripalpus.
Got it. Tenuricus and solicitan sound familiar.
They are major coastal pests. Now, if you go north of, say, Daytona on the east coast or Port Richey on the west coast, salt marshes become more dominant than mangroves.
Dominated by those salt-tolerant grasses and plants.
Yeah, things like saltgrass, pickleweed, sometimes black mangrove. And guess who the main breeders are?
Let me guess. Aedes tenuricus and Aedes sollicitans.
Bingo. Those two again. So remember them for both mangrove swamps and salt marshes. Very important association.
Okay, consistent pair there. What about salt or brackish ditches? Often near the marshes, right?
Yep, adjacent to them. These ditches often have a wider variety of grasses, so they can support a more diverse mosquito crowd.
So more species.
A few more, yes. You'll find our familiar friends Aedes tenuricus and sollicitans, but also Aedes atlanticus, Saurophora columbiae, Anopheles bradley, Culex pellucis, and even the big ones, Saurophora howardi and Saurophora ciliata.
Wow, that's a longer list. But recognizing tenuricus and sollicitans as the common theme in salty spots is helpful.
Definitely a good starting point. Okay, ready to move inland to freshwater habitat.
Let's do it. First up, freshwater marshes.
Right. These are pretty common, often near the coast, sometimes grading into brackish areas. Think western coast, Everglades, sawgrass country.
Okay, who lives here?
Key species to associate with freshwater marshes: Anopheles walkeri, Anopheles crucians, Saurophora columbiae, again, Culex nigripalpus, versatile, Culex salinarius, Culex tersalis, Culex erraticus, and Culex picator. Quite a mix of genera Anopheles, Saurophora, Culex.
Lots of Culex there. Okay, next, lakes.
Yeah, and the source material makes a distinction. Sandy bottom lakes. Not as much habitat.
Less stuff for them to hide in.
Pretty much. But silty bottom lakes, especially with cypress trees, floating plants like water lilies, emergent reeds, much more habitat.
Makes sense. Where do the larvae hang out?
Usually near the shore, among the vegetation, or really anywhere if there's enough plant cover.
And the species list for lakes. For exam focus.
Okay, for lakes, Anopheles smaragdinus, Anopheles crucians, Anopheles quadrimaculatus, a big one, Anopheles walkeri, Uranotaenia sapphirina, and Loei, those tiny ones. Culex salinarius, Culex nigripalpus, Culex erraticus, Culex picator, and importantly, Coquillatidia perturbans and the Mansonia species.
Ah, those last ones have special requirements, right?
They do. We'll touch on that. But yeah, associate them with vegetated lakes and ponds.
Okay. What about ponds and seepage areas?
Also, key freshwater spots. Ponds can be temporary, like woodland ponds that fill with rain, or more permanent, like deep sinkhole ponds. Seepage areas are just those damp, marshy spots often found near hillsides or other water bodies.
Different species for ponds versus seepage.
Some overlap, some preferences. Ponds often have Anopheles crucians, Anopheles quadrimaculatus, Culiceta inornata, Cuthesi melanura, important for viruses, Restuin selenarius, Eraticus, Picator, Pilosus, territans, frog feeder, and Aedes canadensis.
Quite the pond party. And seepage areas.
Tend to favor Anopheles punctipennis, Anopheles georgianus, Anopheles quadrimaculatus again, Aedes stycticus, and Sorphira ferox.
Got it. Now, springs seem tricky because the water moves.
It does, which limits things. Breeding really only happens along the quiet edges where there's vegetation and very little current.
And the species.
Primarily Anopheles quadrimaculatus and Anopheles perplexans. So for exams, springs equal limited breeding, specific species, quiet edges.
Clear. Okay, swamps, dense trees, cypress, maple.
Classic Florida habitat. You'll find Anopheles smaragdinus, Anopheles maverlius, Anopheles inundatus, Anopheles diluvialis, some specific swamp Anopheles there, plus familial ones like Anopheles crucians, Anopheles quadrimaculatus, Culiceta melanura, Aedes canadensis, and those Mansonia and Coquilitidia species again.
Seems like Anopheles quadrimaculatus pops up a lot in freshwater.
It's very adaptable, a key species to know. Now, man-made stuff. Borrow pits and canals.
Like roadside ditches or pits where they dug out fill.
Exactly. Initially, maybe not great habitat, but as they age, silt up, get weedy, they become much better mosquito producers.
And what breeds there?
A real mix shows up. Anopheles maverlius, Anopheles quadrimaculatus, Culiceta inornata, Sorphira columbiae, Aedes canadensis, several culucolcs, Nigropulpus, Conchofasciatus, Restuins, Salinarius, even Anopheles albumanus sometimes, and Coquilitidia and Mansonia.
Okay. You mentioned specific plant associations earlier.
Right. This is important. Those Coquilitidia perturbans, Mansonia diari and Mansonia titillans, their larvae don't come to the surface for air. They actually tap into the underwater stems and roots of certain aquatic plants to breathe.
Wow. Okay. So they need specific plants.
They do, like water hyacinth, cattails, pickerel weed, and then you have plants that hold water themselves, like bromeliads or pitcher plants. They host unique species like Wyomia venduzae, Wyomia michelli, Wyomia haenae, and Culex biscanesis, very specialized.
Fascinating. Okay, what about those temporary puddles? Rain and floodwater pools.
Ah, the floodwater mosquitoes. These pools appear after heavy rain, don't last long, and usually don't have true aquatic plants, maybe just some leaf litter.
And who rushes in to breed there?
This is prime territory for Sorphira and many Aedes species. Their eggs are laid on damp soil and wait for the flood. The list is long. Sorphira johnstonia, Sorphira pygmaea, Aedes atlanticus, Aedes duprae, Aedes fulvus pallens, Aedes infirmatus, Aedes michelae, Aedes asticticus, Aedes tormentor, Aedes vexans, a big pest, Aedes cinereus. Some culex like Atratus, Pilosus, Baumensis, and Nigropulpus can use them too.
So, quick in, quick out breeders.
Exactly. Very boom and bust.
All right, a few more specific spots. Tree holes, like cavities in trees.
Yep, rot holes that collect rainwater. They support a really unique little community. You get Anopheles barberi, the predatory Toxorynchites larvae, which actually eat other mosquito larvae.
Oh, cool. Good mosquitoes.
Sort of. Also Aedes tricheriitis, a vector, Aedes hendersoni, orthopotamia species, Aedes thibaulti, and the invasive Aedes albopictus, Asian tiger mosquito, loves them too.
Okay. And crab holes. That sounds unique.
Very unique. Mainly on the southeastern coast, associated with the big land crab, Curtisoma guanhumi. Two mosquito species specialize here, Dinocerates cancer and Culex opistopus.
Wow. Specialized indeed. What about regular freshwater drainage ditches, like in pastures or along roads?
Yeah, common landscape features. They can host Sorphira columbia, various Culex, Nigropulpus, Pilosus, Eraticus, Quinquefasciatus, Anopheles crucians and walkeri, Aedes atlanticus, the little Urantintina species, Sorphira ciliata, and interestingly, even Aedes sollicitans sometimes turns up if they're near coastal areas. Shows some flexibility.
Right. And finally, the ones we create ourselves. Artificial containers.
Ah, yes. Around our homes, cans, buckets, old tires, bird baths, clogged gutters, unused swimming pools.
Breeding grounds right in our backyard.
Absolutely. And this is prime habitat for some major pest and vector species, especially Aedes aegypti, yellow fever mosquito, and Aedes albopictus, Asian tiger. Also Aedes triceriatus, Culex quinquefasciatus, Culex restuins, Culex salinarius, Culex nigropulpus, and even Anopheles quadrimaculatus will use containers sometimes.
That list includes some really important ones from a public health perspective.
Definitely. And they're often the ones most directly impacted by community cleanup efforts.
Okay, so that's a lot of habitats. To wrap this up for, say, exam prep, the big picture is...
Florida's got a huge diversity of potential mosquito breeding sites. Salt, fresh, brackish, still water preferred, natural, man-made, vegetated, not vegetated. Each type tends to favor certain species.
So understanding those connections, habitat type to key species, is crucial.
Absolutely. If you know the habitat, you can make a good guess about the likely mosquito inhabitants. That's the core knowledge. Focus on those main habitat types we covered and the major species linked to each.
Great summary. Yeah, the key takeaway really is that diversity. Florida's mosquito scene is complex, and where they breed is tied directly to these specific environmental conditions. Knowing that is fundamental whether you're studying for an exam or just want to understand the ecology here.
Exactly, which, leads to a bigger thought to maybe leave folks with. Well, given this incredible variety, all these different breeding sites, all these species with their own habits spread across Florida's incredibly diverse landscapes, what do you think are the biggest challenges in actually controlling them effectively? Trying to manage mosquito populations in a way that works for public health but also considers the environment.
That's a really good question. Balancing control with ecology across such a complex state.
It's definitely something to chew on, a huge challenge.
You ever feel like you just need the quick version? Get right to the point on something you deal with all the time. That's what we do here on The Deep Dive. And today, we're tackling Florida mosquitoes.
Yep. Florida's definitely got its share. A huge variety, actually. And look, they're annoying, sure, but knowing which ones are buzzing around, that's really crucial if you want to manage them effectively. It's important for public health, too.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We've got these detailed identification guides the pros use for Florida mosquitoes. We're going to pull out the need-to-know info for you, how to tell them apart, roughly, which ones cause the most problems, the usual suspects, and maybe touch on a few other interesting ones, too. We're aiming for practical understanding, not drowning you in scientific jargon.
Right. We're digging into what makes them unique, their looks, where they breed, that sort of thing. By the time we're done, you should have a much clearer picture of the mosquito situation in Florida, who's who, and why it might matter to you.
Okay, let's dive in. Why bother telling them apart? I mean, a bite's a bite, isn't it? Isn't it just itchy?
Well, yeah, the itch is pretty universal. But knowing the species, that's step one for smart control. See, different types have totally different lifestyles. Where they lay eggs, when they bite, it all varies. So controlling salt marsh breeders is completely different from handling, say, the ones breeding in your flower pot.
Okay, that makes sense. Different strategy for different bugs.
Yeah.
So how do scientists actually start differentiating these tiny things?
They look really closely at both stages, the larvae, the wigglers in the water, and the flying adults. In Florida, mosquitoes fall into three main subfamilies, Toxohinctinae, Anopheline, and Culicinae, and even the larvae look different.
Larvae.
Right.
The wigglers. So what are the key differences there? What should we picture?
Well, one big thing is the siphon. It's like a little breathing tube, a snorkel. The Toxohinctinae larvae are fascinating. They live in tree holes, old tires, things like that. And they actually eat other mosquito larvae.
Wait, really? Mosquitoes eating mosquitoes?
Yeah. Nature's a little pest control, like you said. They've kind of a blocky head, bristly bodies. And the adult females, they don't even bite us, just nectar.
That's wild. Okay, so that's one type. What about the Anopheles larvae?
Right, Anopheles, they're different. No siphon, none at all. And they have these little leaf-shaped hairs on their abdomen segments. You'll usually see them lying parallel flat on the water surface.
Okay, no snorkel, leaf hairs, lying flat. Got it. And the third group, Culicinae.
That's the big one. Most of the common mosquitoes belong here. Their larvae do have a siphon, though it might have little comb-like teeth called a pecten, or maybe not. But they definitely lack those palmate, those leaf-like hairs. And they typically hang at an angle in the water, maybe 45 degrees, head down.
So siphon, how they hang in the water. Those are big clues for the larvae. What about the adults, the ones that actually fly around and bite?
Adult features matter too, absolutely. Wing patterns, leg bands, the shape of their body parts. There are guides, like Figure 20 in some references, that show differences between adult Anopheles and Culicines, for example. Now, with practice and maybe a hand lens, you might be able to make some IDs in the field. But for real certainty, especially down to the species level, you usually need a lab, a good microscope, 10x to 40x magnification, sometimes even more for tiny details.
Wow, okay. Sounds pretty involved for such a small insect. These guides you mentioned, the pictorial keys.
Yeah.
How do they work? Is it complicated?
It sounds more complicated than it is. Think of it like a choose-your-own-adventure, but for mosquitoes. You start at the beginning, look at a feature like, does it have spots on its wings, yes or no, and follow the arrow based on your mosquito. You keep answering these either questions based on the pictures until you land on the genus, which narrows it down a lot. There are separate keys for larvae and adult females because they look so different.
Like a visual flowchart. Okay, I get it. You just follow the clues. So let's talk about the ones we really notice, the ones ruining the barbecue. Who are the main culprits in Florida?
Hands down, the biggest players, especially near the coast, are the salt marsh mosquitoes. That's primarily Aedes taeniorhynchus and Aedes sollicitans. These are the ones that can emerge in just massive, overwhelming numbers after high tides or big rains flood the marshes.
Ugh, yeah, the beach swarms.
Yeah.
So tell me about Aedes taeniorhynchus. What makes it so common?
Okay, taeniorhynchus, its small black and white markings. Look for narrow white bands on its tarsi, that's the lower part of the leg, and also a band on its proboscis, its beak. The wing scales are all dark. It's the dominant coastal species. Breeds in damp soil where there's thick vegetation. And the egg numbers, they can be astronomical, up to 100 million per acre.
100 million per acre. Okay, that explains the swarms. What triggers the hatching?
Just add water. Flooding from tides or rain. What's really effective for them is that the eggs can sit there, dormant, in dry soil for ages. Then bam, water comes, they hatch. Larval development time depends on temperature and food, the usual. Adults emerge over a few days, mate in flight, rest a bit, and then they can migrate. Pretty far, actually. Downwind along the coast, sometimes 20, 25 miles.
They travel, so they might bite you miles from where they hatched.
Could happen, yeah. They feed on nectar for flight fuel. Females need blood for eggs, though sometimes the first batch is autogenous, no blood needed. They're most active after sunset, usually. But if you disturb their daytime resting spots, dark, moist places, they'll definitely come out and bite.
Okay, small, black and white, coastal, travels far, bites mainly at dusk unless disturbed. Got it. How does the other big salt marsh one, Aedes sollicitans, compare?
Aedes sollicitans. Also very common coastally, maybe even more so than taeniorhynchus up in North Florida sometimes. It's a bit larger, more golden brownish overall. The pale bands on the legs and proboscis are wider. And check the wings they have, mixed light and dark scales, not all dark. Plus, a pale stripe right down the middle of the top of the abdomen.
A bit bigger, more golden, wider bands, mixed wing scales.
Okay.
Similar breeding spots?
Pretty similar, yeah. Salt marshes, primarily, but also coastal swales, even some inland brackish spots. Behavior-wise, though, the adult females are known for being, persistent. They bite readily pretty much any time of day if you're around, not just dusk.
Oh, great. The relentless biter. So these salt marsh types are mainly a problem May through October, roughly.
Typically, yeah. It tracks with the warmer weather, the tides, the rainy season. But it really depends year to year. And remember, they aren't the only game in town. There are plenty of major pests that breed in freshwater, too.
Right, freshwater. Okay, who are the big names there?
Well, you've got your floodwater species first. These pop up after heavy rains flood temporary areas. Think Sorophora columbiae, Sorophora ferox, and a few Ades like Atlanticus and Formatus and Mitchellei. Then you have mosquitoes that like more permanent freshwater ponds, ditches, that kind of thing. Key players there are Culex nigripalpus, Culex cuncafasciatus, and Culex salinarius.
Lots of different freshwater habitats, it sounds like. Any of those stand out as particularly troublesome?
Oh, yeah. Cochulatidia perturbans can be a huge nuisance statewide. Their larvae are really unique. They pierce the roots or stems of aquatic plants to breathe underwater.
Underwater, breathing through plants. That's clever.
Isn't it? And Mansonia dieri, especially in Central and South Florida, is often linked with water lettuce. Its larvae do something similar. Up in the Panhandle, especially in spring, Aedes canadensis and Aedes stichticus can be real pests after floods.
Okay, a lot of variety depending on location and water type. Now, there are a couple of Aedes species that often make headlines because of diseases, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus.
Right. Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. Small, dark, very distinctive lyre-shaped pattern in silvery white scales on its thorax, its back, and bright white bands on its legs. Historically, it was the domestic mosquito breeding right around houses and containers, tin cans, old tires, flower vases, you name it, even tree holes and bromeliads.
So it likes living near people.
Exactly. Though, interestingly, its numbers have dropped quite a bit in North and Central Florida. There's a thought that maybe the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus, is outcompeting it.
A mosquito turf war. Wow.
Seems like it in some places. Aegypti can develop fast, maybe 10 days from egg to adult in warm weather. The biters are wary, often go for ankles, and they don't fly far. And yeah, historically a major vector of yellow fever and dengue. There were big eradication campaigns against it back in the day.
Okay, and its rival, the Asian tiger, Aedes albopictus.
Ah, yes, albopictus. Showed up in Florida around 1986. Now it's basically everywhere except maybe the middle and lower keys. It often moves into the same container habitats as Aegypti.
And it looks similar.
Similar size, dark color, white markings. But the key difference on the back is albopictus has a single, bright, silvery white stripe right down the middle. Very contrasting black and silver look overall.
Single stripe versus lyre shape. Got it? And its biting habits.
Aggressive. And it's a daytime biter, which makes it particularly annoying. It's a major dengue vector in Asia, so there's always a background concern here in the U.S.
Daytime biting. Ugh.
Uh-huh.
Okay. What about some of those other Aedes you mentioned earlier, the freshwater ones?
Let's see. Aedes triceriatus. Breeds in tree holes, but also containers, sometimes alongside Aegypti and albopictus.
Right.
Dark, shiny white scales on the thorax. Bites during the day or early evening near its breeding sites.
Known for a painful bite.
Painful bite, great.
Aedes mitchellii.
Right, mitchellii. Common up north and in the panhandle. Looks a bit like the salt marsh Taenier hincus, but check the legs, they're speckled. And the abdomen has pale stripes or patches down the middle. Breeds in stump holes and floodwater pools. A severe biter.
Okay, speckled legs. Aedes atlanticus and infirmatus, you said they're often together?
Yeah, common floodwater species. Atlanticus is dark, medium-sized, with a very distinct pale stripe right down the middle of its thorax. Bites readily, even in sunlight. Infirmatus looks very similar, but that pale stripe on the thorax is usually broader, maybe extending 2/3 of the way back. Also, bites readily.
Okay, stripe width is the key there. Aedes canadensis.
Aedes canadensis. Pale rings at both the base and the tip of the tarsal segments, the foot parts. Common nuisance floodwater type in North Florida, especially in spring.
And Aedes vexans. That one sounds annoying.
Vexans can be very annoying. It's common pretty much statewide. Look for very narrow pale bands on the legs, and the pale bands on the abdomen often have a little notch in the middle on top. It likes shady places during the day, becomes a pest at dusk and after dark. Larvae are often found in places like irrigated citrus groves.
Irrigated groves. Interesting. Okay, feels like we've covered a lot of Aedes.
Yeah.
What about the saurophora? That feather-legged gallinaper name still sticks with me.
Yeah, Saurophora ciliata. It earns the name. It's a really large mosquito. Looks kind of shaggy with black and yellow scales. The feather legs are obvious. Then there's Saurophora ferox. Smaller, often has a purplish sheen, and distinctive white socks. The tips of its hind legs are white. Also a painful biter, often found in woods.
White socks.
But the really big pest in this group is often Saurophora columbiae. It's a large black and white mosquito. Look for a pale ring near the tip of each femur, the thigh part. This one is a vicious biter, day or night. Can emerge in huge numbers from pastures, ditches, woodland pools, pretty much any temporary floodwater. They can even be a problem for livestock because the numbers get so high.
Wow, okay. Good to know, especially for rural areas. Let's switch gears to Anopheles. We know they're linked to malaria historically. Are they still a big worry in Florida?
Well, malaria transmission isn't a current major issue in Florida, thankfully. But we do have the mosquitoes. 3 main problem species. Anopheles crucians, often breeds in acidic water like cypress swamps, ponds. Wings have pale spots or scales. It has been found carrying malaria, but seems to prefer biting large mammals over humans.
Okay, prefers animals.
Then Anopheles quadrimaculatus. This one is actually a complex of related species. It's the most common and widespread. Breeds in stagnant, alkaline freshwater with vegetation. This was the main malaria vector historically in the southeast U.S.
Malaria mosquito. What does it look like?
Named for the 4 distinct dark spots on its wings. Adults feed mainly at night on humans and animals, often resting in dark places during the day, can have many generations per season.
4 spots on the wings. Okay.
Yeah.
And a third Anopheles.
Anopheles atropos. Breeds in salty water, brackish pools, salt marshes. Adults are pretty much entirely brownish black. They will readily bite humans, even in bright sunlight near their breeding sites. But not known to transmit diseases.
Bites in sunlight, but no diseases. Interesting mix. What about some of those others with unusual names? Colicetta. Mansonia.
Right. Colicetta inornata, a very large mosquito, actually. Breeds in cooler weather, late fall and winter, in pools, ditches, containers. Mostly bites livestock, but will bite people too. Colicetta melanura is smaller, very dark. Breeds in small, permanent freshwater swamps, often in underground crypts. The females almost exclusively bite birds. This one's important because it's the primary vector of eastern equine encephalitis, EE, between birds.
Okay, the bird-to-bird E transmitter.
Exactly. Then Corculotidia perturbans, remember the one with larvae that tap into plant roots, found statewide. Bites fiercely at night or in shade. It's suspected of being a bridge vector transmitting EE occasionally from birds to horses and humans. It's fairly large, golden brown.
Ah, the potential bridge vector. And Mansonia.
Similar larval habits. Mansonia titillans uses various aquatic plants. Mansonia diari in Florida is primarily found with water lettuce. Both can be pests near their habitats.
Okay, almost there. Last big group, Culex. I think I remember hearing about Culex and St. Louis encephalitis.
You did. That's primarily Culex nigripelpus, but let's start with Culex quinquefasciatus, the southern house mosquito. Larvae love foul water, sewage ditches, catch basins, polluted containers. Adults have pale bands at the base of their abdominal segments, and these bands are kind of rounded on the back edge. Females prefer birds, but definitely bite humans, especially at night, often indoors. Can transmit SLE, St. Louis encephalitis.
Okay, like sturdy water, bites indoors. Culex elinarius.
Often found breeding near Culex nigripelpus, likes ground depressions, stump holes. Emerges more in cooler months. Females bite outdoors, sometimes indoors. Look for golden scales covering the whole top of the 7th abdominal segment.
Golden scales on the tail end, got it. And Culex nigripelpus, the SLE connection.
Yes, nigripelpus. Small, dark overall, but with distinct white patches on the sides of the abdomen. Breeds in various permanent or semi-permanent waters, especially with decaying vegetation. Can tolerate brackish water too. Usually bites outdoors at dusk and night. It was the primary vector during the big SLE epidemic in Tampa Bay years ago. Because of that, it's been studied a lot.
The main SLE guy. Okay, one more Culex. Restuans.
Culex restuans. Larvae in various freshwater habitats. Adults are more common in cooler weather. Females sometimes bite indoors at night, but strongly prefer birds. Looks similar to quinquefasciatus, but the abdominal bands tend to be straight across, not rounded, and often has 2 or 4 pale spots on the thorax.
Spots on the thorax, straight bands. Okay, any others worth a quick mention?
Well, there are some locally annoying ones. Deinocerite's cancer breeds in land crab holes near the coast and bites if you disturb the crabs. And Wyomia species, small mosquitoes, breed in water held by plants. In Florida, Wyomia vandazii breeds in bromeliads, the air plants, and will bite people nearby.
Bromeliad mosquitoes. Okay, I think my head is officially full of mosquito facts.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
It really is a diverse group, but hopefully breaking it down helps. We've talked about why ID matters, how it's done with larvae and adults, and we've hit the highlights of the big pests, the salt marsh shadies, the container Hades, the Saurophora, the Culex, the Anopheles, plus some of the other interesting ones like Coquiotidia and Culiceta, their looks, breeding, biting habits.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like we covered the mission getting that essential overview of Florida's mosquito landscape without needing a PhD in entomology. You listening should have a much better sense now of who might be buzzing around your backyard or the beach.
Absolutely. And it does make you think, doesn't it? You know, with all this diversity, all these different lifestyles, how do things like development, changing rainfall patterns, or even our own control efforts affect these different populations? What does that mean long-term for nuisance levels and public health in Florida? Something to keep mulling over.
You know that buzz you hear in the summer air? And then, that itchy bump later. Mosquitoes. They're just, well, part of warmer weather for a lot of us.
They really are.
But have you ever really thought about what goes into controlling them? I mean, you see the trucks sometimes, maybe hear about treating ponds. But what's the actual process? What really happens behind the scenes to keep those numbers down?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because what looks like maybe just a simple spray run is actually a pretty carefully planned operation. It involves a lot of, planning, understanding the actual science behind it, and maybe surprisingly, a whole load of specialized gear and real know-how.
Okay.
So today we're going to dig into this document that outlines the best practices, the sort of how-to for good mosquito control.
And our mission here.
Basically to pull out the really crucial stuff, who does what tools they actually use, and the science that makes it effective. So you get a solid grasp of it all.
All right, let's get into it. So, leading the whole effort, there's the director. My first thought might be, okay, they just handle the spraying schedule or something. But this document says it's way bigger, like every aspect of the program. What does that actually mean in practice?
It really is a huge role. So the director starts by figuring out the problem itself. How bad is it? Which mosquitoes? Where are they actually breeding?
Breeding grounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems key.
Absolutely. And finding them isn't always obvious. It takes some real investigation, some detective work to locate those hidden water spots where they lay eggs. Think puddles, containers, marshy areas.
So investigation first, then action.
Exactly. Get the lay of the land.
Yeah.
And once they've got that picture, the director plans the actual projects and the control methods, which approach works best where. It requires some, strategic thinking.
Makes sense.
And it's not just a one-time thing. They're also responsible for checking if the controls are working, evaluation, and keeping up surveillance. Are conditions changing?
So like a feedback loop.
Precisely. That's essential to make sure the efforts are effective and, to adapt if things change, like the weather or the environment.
But it mentions public relations too. Why is that part of the director's job? Seems a bit different from the technical stuff.
Oh, it's crucial. Public support, or at least understanding, is really key. These programs affect the community, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So being open, explaining what they're doing and why that builds trust. And you need cooperation sometimes. Plus, the field changes. New science, new insecticides.
So they need to keep learning.
Constantly. The director has to stay updated. That means going to meetings, reading publications, talking to experts. The document mentions groups like the AMCA, American Mosquito Control Association, and the FMCA in Florida. They're vital resources.
Wow, okay. That's a lot for one person. I assume they have a team.
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't do it alone.
Yeah.
The director relies heavily on supervisors and, critically, the operators, the people actually running the equipment.
Right, the applicators.
Yes. Supervisors make sure instructions are clear, safety's followed, gear's working. But the applicator, they need serious know-how. How to use the equipment safely, how to calibrate it, which we'll get into, maintain it.
Calibration sounds important.
It's vital. And they need to report any problems immediately, any malfunction. It's about getting the right dose out there, effectively and safely. For people, for the environment.
And knowing if it all works.
Yeah.
You need records. Right. The document mentions that too.
You got it. Accurate records are essential. Especially for adult mosquito control. How else you know if what you did last week actually worked? You need that data to evaluate, to adjust, to improve.
Okay, so this constant learning seems like a major theme. Keeping up with new methods, new materials. Why is that continuous education so vital?
Well, simply put, it makes them better at their jobs. Newer techniques might hit the mosquitoes harder, or maybe they're safer, or more targeted.
Right, always looking for improvements.
Exactly. It's about boosting effectiveness. And the document also mentions trying for new folks coming in. They need to understand the what, the how, and really importantly, the why behind the procedures.
And it's not just for the rookies. There are refreshers too.
That's right. Especially for people with certifications, like a pest control operator license, there are often rules about continuing education to keep that license valid. The document mentions 16 hours every 4 years in Florida as an example.
Keeps everyone sharp.
It does. And again, this falls on the director, too. Staying informed through journals, like the AMCA journal mentioned, talking to industry reps, attending those association meetings. It's ongoing.
Okay, so before the spraying or treating starts, there's this whole phase of planning and surveillance, basically knowing your enemy. Why is that first assessment so critical?
It's the absolute foundation. You have to know what you're dealing with, which species, how many, where are they actually breeding. Without that basic info, any control effort is just, well, guessing, wasting time and money.
And you said it needs to be ongoing surveillance, not just a one-off check.
Definitely. Because things change, weather shifts through the seasons, maybe there's construction that alters drainage, or maybe your own control efforts change the situation. So continuous monitoring lets you adapt your strategy and see if what you're doing is working long term.
Makes sense. So how do they actually do this surveillance? What are the methods?
Okay, several ways. For the larvae, the immature ones in the water, a common method is dipping. Using a long-handled dipper to scoop up water samples.
Just dipping randomly.
Oh, no, it's systematic. And crucially, you have to record exactly where you took the sample. Street address, GPS coordinates from a GIS system, or a really detailed description.
Gotcha. Location, location, location.
Exactly. And they often note other things too, like nearby plants, any pollution signs, things that affect breeding. Then the larvae usually get preserved in alcohol and sent off to a lab.
For ID.
Yeah, to know exactly which species you found. And interestingly, the document even mentions using helicopters for this, dipping in big marshy areas you just can't reach easily on foot or by vehicle.
Helicopters for dipping. Wow. Okay, what about the adults, the ones actually biting us?
For adults, light traps are a standard tool. There's the New Jersey trap, good for long-term monitoring at one spot, but it catches other bugs too, which can make sorting tricky. Then there's the CDC miniature trap, often uses CO2, like dry ice, as bait. It tends to catch more mosquitoes, sometimes different types too. It's portable, battery-powered.
But maybe selective.
Yep.
Catches some species better than others.
Exactly. You need to be aware of that bias. Different traps give you slightly different pictures. Figure 24 in the document actually shows what these look like.
Are there other ways besides traps?
Oh yeah. Landing rate counts, which is literally counting how many mosquitoes land on a person in a fixed time. Bit low tech, but direct.
Sounds itchy.
Can be. There are also aspirator collections using a little vacuum device to suck up mosquitoes resting in places like culverts or sheds. And they do track public complaints, phone calls. But those always need verification on the ground.
And you mentioned understanding the terrain, the topography is important.
Hugely important. Knowing the streams, lakes, roads, hills, and valleys, it helps pinpoint potential breeding spots. And it's vital for planning source reduction, things like fixing drainage issues.
Source reduction, like getting rid of the breeding sites altogether.
That's the goal where possible. And knowing where parks, bridges, power lines are, that matters for planning sprays safely. The document lists useful maps. Relief maps showing elevation, road maps, population maps, soil, drainage, aerial photos. Very helpful.
You can overlay them.
Yeah, like planning engineering work on top of a drainage map or marking out exact spray zones for pilots on an aerial photo, like in Figure 25. It's all about precision planning.
Okay, planning done, surveillance done. Now for the action. The equipment. Sounds like there's quite a range.
There really is. What a district needs depends a lot on its size and type of environment. For larviciding, you've got older methods like backpack sprayers, hand-cranked granular spreaders.
Still used.
Oh, yes. While machines are common now for big areas, those knapsack sprayers are still perfect for tricky spots. Urban yards, roadside ditches, storm drains, catch basins, very targeted.
And for the big, hard-to-reach places.
That's where aerial application comes in. Airplanes, helicopters, especially for large marshes or flooded areas where ground vehicles just can't go.
Okay, and then for the adults, fogging and spraying.
Right. Adulticiding. That usually means fogging, spraying, or something called ULV, ultra-low volume spraying.
ULV sounds efficient.
It is. Districts often have a whole fleet. Cars, jeeps, special fog trucks, tractors, even heavy stuff like drag lines or bulldozers.
The little dozers.
For mosquitoes.
For habitat reduction. Building dikes, filling in chronic water spots, managing sanitary landfills so they don't become breeding grounds. It's part of that source reduction idea.
Ah, okay. And the actual sprayers. Various types. Mist blowers, cold foggers, thermal foggers that make that visible fog cloud, and those ULV machines we mentioned, which create super fine droplets. And aircraft, again, planes and helicopters used for both larvae and adults. Fixed-wing planes are often the most efficient for really large areas.
Got it. Now, this next bit sounds really critical, maybe a bit technical. The science of the spray, calibration and droplet size. Why is calibrating ULV equipment so vital?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. ULV breaks the insecticide into tiny, tiny droplets. Calibration makes sure the machine is putting out exactly the right amount of insecticide per minute or per acre, whatever the label says.
Why is the exact amount so important?
Well, too little and it just won't work, won't kill the mosquitoes. Too much and it's wasteful, costs more, and potentially increases risks to other non-target organisms or the environment. Precision is key.
Okay. The document says it's actually a pretty simple process.
Relatively speaking, yes. Doesn't need fancy gear. Basically a stopwatch and some measuring cups or cylinders.
But it's the procedure.
In simple terms, you disconnect the spray line going to the nozzle. Start the machine. Set the flow meter dial to what you think is right. Then you run it for a set time, usually a minute, collecting the insecticide that comes out in your measuring container.
And then check if it matches the target rate.
Exactly. You compare what you collected to the rate the label recommends. If it's off, you adjust the flow meter setting, run the test again until it's spot on, then reconnect the line. Always good to double check.
Now, it mentioned something interesting about temperature affecting older flow meters. The ball type one.
Ah, yes, that's an important point for older gear. With those, the thickness, the viscosity of the insecticide can change quite a bit with temperature. Colder liquid flows slower, warmer flows faster, even at the same dial setting.
So you could be putting out the wrong amount without realizing it.
Precisely. The document gives an example with malathion. Just a 5-degree Fahrenheit difference could change the output by half a fluid ounce per minute. That adds up. But this isn't really an issue with newer ULV machines. They typically use positive displacement pumps. These push out a set volume regardless of viscosity changes from temperature, much more consistent.
Good improvement. And it mentions flushing the system.
Yes, very important. Flushing with isopropyl alcohol after every use helps prevent insecticide residue from building up and clogging those tiny nozzles. Critical for ULV.
Okay, so you've got the amount right through calibration. But what about the size of the droplets?
Also critical. Droplet size is key for the spray to drift effectively and actually make contact with flying mosquitoes. Too big, they fall too fast. Too small, they might drift too far or evaporate. The label usually specifies the target droplet size range.
And how do you check that?
Used to involve waving coded slides through the spray cloud, which wasn't always consistent. Now, the document mentions improvements like using a stand with an arm to hold the slides, getting a more uniform sample.
What affects the droplet size?
Several things. The flow rate you set, the insecticide formulation itself, the pressure in the system, even temperature can play a small role sometimes.
You need to check it regularly.
Definitely. The recommendation is check it after any repairs or maintenance on the spray system, check it routinely, say every 100 hours of operation, and check it anytime you suspect something might be off.
Okay. What about the thermal foggers? Is calibration different there?
It is, mainly because the volumes are much higher. You need bigger measuring containers because you're putting out gallons per hour, not ounces per minute like ULV.
But temperature isn't a factor.
Generally not for discharge rate, no. Because the insecticide in thermal fogging is usually heavily diluted with oil, the solution is thin, low viscosity, so temperature changes don't affect its flow rate much.
Got it. And finally, the document really hammers home the importance of maintenance for all this gear. Seems obvious, but why the strong emphasis?
Because breakdowns are disastrous in mosquito control. It's not just annoying or expensive to fix.
Timing, right.
Exactly. Timing is everything. If your main ULV truck breaks down right when you have a major mosquito emergence after a rain, you might completely miss the window to effectively control them. It undermines the whole program.
So preventative maintenance is key.
Absolutely. And the document stresses having the manuals, instruction manuals, parts manuals for every single piece of equipment. And not just having them, but making sure operators and supervisors actually know what's in them and can find info quickly.
Makes sense. Be prepared. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We dove into this document on mosquito control best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear it's way more involved than you might think. You've got the director overseeing everything, a whole team involved, especially those crucial applicators needing solid training on safe use and calibration.
Right, that calibration for ULV, getting the dose and droplet size just right is so important.
And the need for constant learning, staying updated. Plus the whole planning and surveillance part, understanding the species, where they breed, using tools like dipping, traps, maps.
Before you even think about which equipment to use, whether it's backpack sprayers, ULV machines on trucks, or even aircraft for those big jobs.
And finally, keeping all that equipment running smoothly through good maintenance is non-negotiable.
That covers the core of it, yeah. It's a complex system with lots of moving parts, all aimed at effectively managing mosquito populations.
So hopefully you, our listener, now have a much clearer picture of all the thought, the science, and the hard work that goes into those local mosquito control efforts you might see or hear about.
It's definitely a field that requires a mix of biology, engineering, public health, and practical skill.
And for a final thought to leave you with, we've talked a lot about the methods and technology used today, but consider how this field balances effectiveness with environmental impact and public health concerns. As technology like, say, drone applications or new biological controls emerge, how might these practices continue to evolve, and what new ethical questions might arise? Something to think about. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that, well, bites us all, sometimes literally. Mosquito control. Mm-hmm. You're here to get smart fast, and we've sifted through the information to bring you the essential understanding of how we manage these persistent pests.
That's right. And when you think about mosquito control, maybe your first thought is just a swat or a spray can, perhaps.
Right.
But the reality, as our sources really lay out, it's a much broader and more strategic effort.
So
it ranges from simple things, stuff we can do around our own homes, to really quite interesting large-scale interventions in the environment.
And chemical tools, too, I imagine.
Oh, yes. Targeted biological and chemical tools are a big part of it.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Something that sounds almost too obvious, maybe. Mm-hmm. But our sources emphasize its importance. Premises sanitation.
Yeah.
We're talking about our own backyards here, right?
Yeah.
Why is just keeping our property tidy such a key first step?
Exactly. It's really about cutting off the supply at the source.
Eliminating breeding spots.
Precisely. Eliminating places where mosquitoes can breed. And our materials highlight that this is, well, surprisingly effective.
Really?
Yeah, think beyond just puddles. We're talking about things like old jars, maybe forgotten in the garage, tires stacked up collecting rainwater.
Oh, yeah, tires are bad for that.
Definitely. Even something as seemingly harmless as a bird bath or the water that can collect in the leaves of certain plants. These can be just ideal nurseries for several mosquito species.
So something as simple as me emptying that forgotten bucket in the shed that can actually put a dent in the local mosquito population, it feels almost too basic.
For some species, it truly is that straightforward. And it's, a proactive step everyone can take.
Right.
And building on this idea of managing their habitat, our sources then move into the larger scale techniques, land and water management.
Okay, this sounds like we're talking about really reshaping the environment now. What kind of interventions are effective at this level?
Well, one historically successful method, particularly in Florida, as our sources detail, is ditching in salt marshes.
Ditching, like digging ditches.
Yeah. By creating these networks of shallow channels, you improve the circulation of water.
Okay, and why is that important?
Because it allows fish, which are natural predators of mosquito larvae, to reach them more easily. So it's not just about getting rid of the water, it's making the environment less hospitable for larvae and more accessible to their predators.
Ah, that's clever, a two-pronged approach. Our sources also mention diking and impoundments in salt marshes. How does that work? Is it similar?
It's a bit different. This technique involves creating barriers, dikes, to control water flow. In salt marshes, certain mosquitoes lay their eggs on damp soil, not directly on water.
Nice.
So by diking and creating these shallow impoundments, you essentially cover that damp soil with a thin layer of water. Since these specific mosquitoes don't lay eggs on the water surface, it prevents them from breeding there.
Okay, these big interventions, diking, ditching, they sound like they would definitely require a lot of permissions. Our source mentions environmental permitting. Can you elaborate on that? Why is it necessary?
Absolutely. Because these land and water management techniques intentionally alter the environment, right? So they're subject to environmental regulations.
Makes sense.
It's to ensure we're not causing unintended negative consequences. In Florida, activities like dredging or filling in submerged lands or these transitional zones, they typically require permits under Chapter 17 to 4 of the Florida Administrative Code, unless, specific exemptions apply.
So if a mosquito control district wanted to start one of these projects, who do they need to get approval from? It sounds complex.
It can be. The primary agency is the Department of Environmental Protection.
Okay.
They then coordinate with other state agencies and also the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Right.
And depending on the location and the specific project, the relevant water management district might also get involved.
Wow.
Interestingly, though, our sources do point out that routine maintenance of existing mosquito control projects might be exempt from some of these permitting requirements, especially if any removed material, the spoil, is placed on upland areas.
Navigating all that sounds like it could be a real headache for these districts. Do our sources mention any support available?
They do, actually. The Bureau of Scientific Evaluation and Technical Assistance, which is within the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, they actually provide assistance to mosquito control districts in developing these permit applications.
Ah, that's helpful.
Yeah, it helps ensure these important water management tools can still be used, effectively and responsibly.
Okay. Let's shift gears now to a method that probably comes to mind for most people when they think about mosquito control. Chemical control.
Right, the sprays.
Exactly. Our sources highlight its significant role globally in reducing disease and, improving our quality of life.
That's definitely true. Chemical control has been absolutely instrumental in protecting public health. It's even made certain regions habitable by suppressing mosquito-borne illnesses.
What?
But as our sources also clearly indicate, the use of chemicals is a topic that, quite understandably, raises public concern.
Absolutely. People worry about side effects, environmental impacts, all that. But in Florida, our sources differentiate between larvicides and adulticides. What's the sort of fundamental difference there in how and when they're used?
Okay, so larvicides are designed to target the immature stages, the aquatic stages, the larvae and their breeding habitats, the water.
Got it. Before they fly.
Exactly. Adulticides, on the other hand, are used to control the adult flying mosquitoes.
Okay.
And it's really crucial to remember that in Florida, with very few exceptions, any chemical used for mosquito control must be approved by the EPA and registered with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. That's a legal requirement.
Right. Important safety check. Let's start with larvicides then. Our sources categorize them into contact larvicides, surface control agents, and stomach toxins. That's quite a range of approaches just for larvae.
Yes, and each category uses a pretty distinct mechanism. Contact larvicides like temifos, which is an organophosphate.
Oh, organophosphate, okay.
Yeah, they work by directly affecting the larva's nervous system. They inhibit an enzyme called cholinesterase.
Is that dangerous? Organophosphate sounds kind of serious.
Well, while it belongs to that class, temifos itself is considered to have relatively low to moderate acute toxicity, especially at the concentrations used. It comes in various forms, like granules, liquids, and its labels will carry warning or caution signals.
Okay.
Our sources note it's approved for use in a variety of habitats, tidal marshes, woodland pools, even polluted water, and those discarded tires we mentioned.
Interesting. Then there are hormone mimics like methoprene. How do these work? That sounds different.
Methoprene is a really interesting example of what's called a biopesticide. It essentially mimics a juvenile hormone that's naturally present in insects.
Okay.
This hormone needs to be absent for a mosquito pupa to develop properly into an adult. So by introducing methoprene, you disrupt this hormonal balance.
And it stops them from becoming adults.
Exactly. It prevents the pupa from completing its transformation into a flying adult. But it's important to note it only targets these immature stages. It has absolutely no effect on adult mosquitoes that are already flying around.
Got it. Okay, surface control agents. That sounds like they take a more physical approach,
Yeah.
like larviciding oils.
Precisely. These oils create a very thin film on the water surface.
And that does what?
That film prevents mosquito larvae and pupa from being able to reach the surface to breathe. So effectively, it drowns them. They can also trap newly emerged adults that might be resting on the water surface before they fly off. These oils are generally quite effective, especially against pupa, and they have low toxicity when used correctly. That's reflected in their caution label.
And then there are these monomolecular surface films, like AeroSurf MSF.
Yeah.
That sounds very high tech.
They are a more recent development, yeah. These films are biodegradable and they spread really rapidly across the water surface. Their mode of action is physical, not toxic.
How physical?
By significantly lowering the surface tension of the water. Larvae and pupa need that surface tension to hang at the surface to breathe through their siphons.
Oh, okay.
Lowering the tension prevents that, leading to suffocation. It also makes it difficult for adult mosquitoes to emerge successfully from the pupal case.
And they break down.
Yeah, because they break down relatively quickly. They're most suitable for use in contained standing water, like roadside ditches or containers where there are minimal non-target organisms.
Right. Okay, last category for larvicides. Stomach toxins. That sounds direct.
In a way, it is. We're talking about microbial larvicides here. Things like Bacillus thuringiensis, Zurulensis, usually it's called BT,
The BT, okay.
and Bacillus cephyricus, or BS. These are actually naturally occurring bacteria.
Bacteria. We're using bacteria to kill mosquitoes.
We are. When mosquito larvae ingest them, eat them, a toxin produced by the bacteria, a specific protein crystal, disrupts their digestive system, kills them from the inside, essentially.
Wow. And is BT safe?
What's really notable about Bitrat is its specificity. It's highly effective in various outdoor environments, irrigation ditches, floodwater, ponds, marshes, you name it. And our sources emphasize its safety profile, very low risk to wildlife, non-target organisms, and the environment when it's applied according to the label directions.
That's impressive. And BS.
BS works in a similar way, disrupting the gut. It tends to have a slower action than Bitrat, but it can sometimes persist in the environment longer, giving longer control in certain situations.
And both are biopesticides.
Yes, both Bitrat and BS are classified as biopesticides by the EPA and carry a caution label.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive look at larvicides. Now let's move on to adulticides, the ones targeting the flying adults.
Right.
Our sources identify organophosphates and pyrethroids as the primary types used in Florida.
That's correct. The organophosphates commonly used include things like malathion, nailed, and chlorpyrifos.
Yep.
While the pyrethroid family includes natural compounds like pyrethrum and pyrethrins, and then synthetic ones like permethrin, resmethrin, samithrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, cyfluthrin, diphenothrine, and also etofinprox, which is kind of pyrethroid-like.
Let's start with the organophosphates again, but for adult control. Malathion, you mentioned it for larvae too, but it's used for adults. It's been around a while, hasn't it?
Yes, a very long history of use, registered back in 1956. For adult control, it works similarly. It gets converted inside the mosquito's body into a compound called malaoxin.
Right, the enzyme inhibitor.
Exactly. That inhibits acetylcholinesterase, that critical enzyme in their nervous system. This disruption leads to overstimulation, paralysis, and ultimately death.
How is it applied?
Malathion can be applied using both ground equipment like trucks and aerial equipment like planes or helicopters. And our sources state it's considered safe when used according to the label instructions.
And nailed. I think you hear about that one more with aerial spraying, maybe after hurricanes or during outbreaks.
That is its primary application in Florida, yeah. Aerial adulticiting. It has a similar mode of action to malathion, inhibiting that same enzyme, acetylcholinesterase. Nailed is highly toxic to insects.
How much do they use?
It's typically applied at very low volumes, like less than an ounce per acre, so tiny amounts spread over a large area.
And the risks?
At these low application rates, the risks to humans, birds, and fish are considered acceptable. However, it does pose a greater risk to non-target invertebrates. Bees are a particular concern.
Right.
So the EPA label includes specific precautions to minimize those risks, like not spraying over blooming crops when bees are active.
Okay, now let's talk about pyrethroids. I associate pyrethrum and pyrethrins with, like, flowers. More natural origin.
You're absolutely right. Pyrethrins are natural insecticides derived from chrysanthemum flowers. They work differently from the organophosphates. They disrupt the sodium channels in the insect's nervous system. This leads to overexcitation, paralysis, and death. A key characteristic of pyrethrins is that they break down really rapidly in sunlight.
So they don't stick around.
Exactly. That makes them relatively environmentally friendly in the sense that they have minimal residual effects.
It's the synthetic pyrethroids. Permethrin, resmethrin. How do they compare? Are they just man-made versions?
Pretty much. Synthetic pyrethroids are chemically designed to mimic the structure and the insecticidal activity of the natural pyrethrins. They also work by affecting those sodium channels in the nervous system, causing that overexcitation.
Are they safe?
Generally, they have low toxicity to mammals and birds when used appropriately. However, just like the natural pyrethrins, they can be toxic to fish and bees.
Okay. Fish and bees again.
Yes. So this toxicity leads to specific EPA label restrictions, things like prohibiting direct application to open water or spraying within 100 feet of water bodies to protect aquatic life.
It really sounds like there's this constant trade-off, doesn't it? Choosing the right chemical, balancing how well it works against mosquitoes versus the potential impacts on, everything else.
Absolutely. It's a critical balancing act. And that's why our sources also delve into other control methods, things that are maybe more permanent or biologically based. There's actually a long history of emphasizing these longer-term approaches.
Like introducing natural predators, right? Our source mentioned creating minnow access dishes in salt marshes or stocking breeding areas with fish.
Exactly. The idea is to establish or enhance a natural balance where predators can help keep mosquito populations in check without constant intervention.
But does that still happen much?
Well, our sources note that in recent years, there's actually been increased opposition and also legislation that has restricted the construction of these types of ditches. So it's limited the use of that specific method.
That's interesting. Just highlights how different factors, public opinion, regulations, can influence the use of even seemingly beneficial methods.
For sure.
But research into other biological controls is still going on, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. There's ongoing research into various diseases that specifically target mosquito larvae, things caused by bacteria, protozoa, fungi, algae, even viruses. The goal is always to find effective biological control agents that are safe for the environment.
Any others on chemical methods?
Our sources also briefly mention using herbicides sometimes, but not against mosquitoes directly. Against aquatic weeds that can provide shelter and breeding sites for larvae.
Habitat modification again?
Kind of, yeah. And there's also research into genetic control methods, things like the sterile male technique, where you release sterile males to mate with wild females so they don't produce viable offspring, or introducing lethal genes.
Is that being used now?
The research is happening, particularly at places like the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory mentioned in our sources, but these genetic methods aren't currently practical for widespread routine implementation, still more experimental.
This all just underscores how important it is to use any control method, but especially chemical insecticides, with really great care. Our sources hammer that point home.
It's paramount, absolutely non-negotiable. Using only products that are specifically labeled for mosquito control,
Right.
applying them at the lowest effective concentration needed to do the job, and strictly adhering to all the label instructions. That's crucial for both effectiveness and safety.
And the equipment matters too.
Hugely. Properly calibrated equipment is essential to make sure you're applying the right amount, and having fully trained applicators running that equipment.
Makes sense.
And importantly, our sources stress that insecticides should be used judiciously, only when necessary, based on surveillance like trapping mosquitoes and testing for diseases, not just as a routine preventative measure, spraying on a schedule whether needed or not.
Okay, this really brings us nicely to the concept of integrated mosquito management, or IMM. It sounds like this is considered the sort of gold standard, the most strategic and responsible approach.
That's precisely right. IMM is widely considered the most effective and sustainable strategy overall. It's a comprehensive approach. It combines various methods strategically.
So mixing and matching.
Exactly. Water and habitat management, biological control where feasible, and targeted chemical control when needed. The key to IMM is a really thorough understanding of mosquito biology and all the local factors that influence their populations.
Why is that understanding so important?
Because that knowledge allows for the strategic and efficient use of chemical controls, which are often costly and have those potential side effects we discussed only when they are most needed and will have the greatest impact, rather than just relying on chemicals as the sole default solution.
And this isn't some brand new idea, is it? Our sources mentioned a policy document on IMM from the American Mosquito Control Association, the AMCA, going back to 2009.
That's correct. IMM is a well-established principle in professional mosquito control. It emphasizes a holistic, evidence-based, and adaptive approach, using that combination of biological, chemical, educational, and physical control methods.
Educational, too.
Yeah, educating the public about things like premises, sanitation, personal protection. That's part of it, too. All aimed at maintaining mosquito populations at levels that are acceptable for public health and comfort while minimizing those negative impacts on the environment.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up our deep dive here, we've really covered a huge spectrum of mosquito control methods. It goes way beyond just spraying.
Absolutely.
From the simplicity of, eliminating standing water around our homes to large-scale environmental engineering like ditching and diking, a diverse array of chemical larvicides and adulticides, each with specific ways they work and specific things to consider.
Right, different tools for different jobs.
Various biological control strategies, some current, some still in research. And then this overarching framework of integrated mosquito management pulling it all together. It's a far more nuanced, multifaceted field than I initially realized.
Indeed. And I think the crucial takeaway here is that effective and responsible mosquito control really requires that strategic, integrated approach. It's not about finding one single silver bullet. It's about understanding the biology of the specific mosquitoes you're dealing with, assessing the specific environmental context, and then thoughtfully applying a combination of methods to achieve the desired outcomes, protecting public health while minimizing those unintended consequences.
And that leads us perfectly to our final thought for you, the listener. Given this really intricate web of environmental factors, public health needs, ecological concerns, everything that shapes these ongoing efforts to manage mosquito populations, what do you think constitutes a truly sustainable and effective long-term strategy? It's certainly a complex puzzle to consider.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that definitely buzzes, sometimes bites, and often just plain bugs us: mosquito control. But get this, it's not just about mosquitoes. We're going to explore this whole surprising range of other arthropods, insects and related critters that affect our lives, and how local authorities, specifically in Florida, deal with them.
Exactly. We've been digging into the sources, like the actual Florida statutes and administrative code. It really pulls back the curtain.
Yeah, we've got the legal stuff, the regulations.
And the practical side, too. How these programs actually run, the challenges they face, and, like you said, this unexpectedly long list of other creatures they end up dealing with.
Seriously, it goes way beyond just mosquitoes. We're talking things like massive swarms of midges that don't even bite but can apparently cause traffic issues.
Yeah. Or even venomous caterpillars, not something you think about every day. Plus all the legal hoops they have to jump through just to operate.
Okay, let's get into it. So legally, where does all this mosquito and, well, arthropod control stuff even start?
Well, the foundation is really Chapter 388 of the Florida statutes. That's the main mosquito control law. And then there are the specific rules in Chapter 5E13 of the Florida Administrative Code.
Gotcha. Chapters 388 and 5E13.
Right. These basically give local governments the green light, the authority to conduct arthropod control, but primarily on public land and under pretty specific conditions laid out in the law.
Public land makes sense dealing with a widespread issue.
Exactly. It shows the state's focus on tackling those bigger public health risks first, before getting involved on private property. It's kind of a balance.
Okay, so that brings up the question.
Yeah.
What about my backyard? Can they just roll up and start spraying?
Nope, not without your... Okay. Chapter 388 is really clear on that doing control work on private property needs the owner's permission. Full stop.
Right.
Now, it can get a little tricky if, say, someone isn't controlling breeding spots on their land and they refuse access to the control district.
Okay. Then what?
Well, then another law, Chapter 386, which covers public health nuisances, might come into play. But honestly, the real push is for collaboration.
Collaboration.
Yeah, district directors are really encouraged to work with the local Department of Health folks and, crucially, with the homeowner. Try to find a solution everyone can live with, Minimize risks without stepping on toes too much.
That seems reasonable. Okay, so they're dealing with pesticides, chemicals. Who makes sure that's all being done safely? Can't just be anyone out there with a sprayer, right?
No, absolutely not. There are very strict regulations. You've got the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act of 1972. Everyone calls it FIFRA.
FIFRA. Got it.
FIFRA basically tasks the EPA with making sure anyone using hazardous or restricted chemicals is properly trained and certified.
Okay, EPA sets the standard.
Right, and then the state handling the certification. In Florida, the governor designates the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Dallas CS, as the lead agency for this.
So Dallas certifies the people doing the spraying.
Exactly. Commercial pest control operators, and importantly for us, the mosquito control personnel applying pesticides. The law is pretty clear. Unless there's a very specific exemption, if you're applying pesticides for mosquito control, you either have to be certified yourself or you have to be working under the direct supervision of someone who is.
That makes a lot of sense. Protects people, protects the environment.
Definitely. It's all about responsible use.
So it sounds like the mosquito control director, specifically, has a ton of responsibility here. What falls under their umbrella for safe pesticide use?
Oh, it's a big job. The director is really the key person ensuring safety. They have to make sure every applicator reads and, crucially, understands the pesticide labels. Those labels have all the critical info on use, safety precautions.
Right. The fine print nobody usually reads, but here it's vital.
Absolutely vital. They also need to make sure the right personal protective equipment, PPE, is used and maintained correctly, and that everyone follows the set procedures for storing chemicals, mixing them properly, and disposing of them in their containers safely.
Okay, so handling the chemicals. What else?
Training is huge, making sure the teams know how to operate all the equipment properly, and even things like safe driving habits, because they're out there in vehicles a lot.
True.
And it goes beyond just the pesticides. The director also has to make sure the district has adequate insurance, meets Social Security Act requirements, follows the right to know law about chemical hazards, and complies with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act.
Wow. Okay, so it's managing chemicals, people, equipment, and a whole lot of regulatory compliance.
Pretty much, yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Public perception.
Yeah.
How important is it for people to actually support these programs? If everyone's complaining, it must make things difficult.
You've really hit on a critical point there. Public awareness, getting their support, their cooperation. It's absolutely essential for a mosquito control program to work well.
How so?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
How well they communicate their goals and methods directly impacts how much funding they get through taxes.
The money angle.
Right. And it affects whether landowners cooperate when they need to do work on private property. It even influences whether folks take their own steps to get rid of standing water and breeding sites around their homes.
So how do they manage that? How do they build, a good public image?
Well, the sources point to three main ways this image gets shaped. First, through the media, newspapers, radio, TV stories.
Okay.
Second, by getting out there and talking to people, directly giving presentations to civic groups, schools, that kind of thing.
Community outreach.
Exactly. And third, just through those individual day-to-day interactions, handling phone calls, responding to letters, personal contacts out in the field. And it's not just broadcasting information out. The whole idea of public relations is that it's a two-way street.
A conversation, not just a lecture.
Precisely. Those calls and letters from the public, they're incredibly valuable. They tell the district where the problems are, how people are reacting to what they're doing, what concerns people have. Directors really should follow up on those complaints.
Makes sense. Eyes and ears on the ground.
Yeah, and it's not just the director. Every single employee contributes to that image just by being courteous, driving safely, being patient when answering questions. It all adds up.
Okay, but even with the best efforts, you're spraying chemicals, you're managing land. There must be pushback sometimes, right? People who aren't happy.
Oh, definitely. It's pretty much inevitable with any large-scale program like this. The sources list several groups that might occasionally oppose certain activities.
Like a
Environmental groups worried about effects on other insects or wildlife. Beekeepers are a big one, concerned about their hives. Public land managers might have different priorities for those areas. Aquaculturists, organic farmers.
Yeah, I can see that.
Concerned citizens just generally worried about health or the environment, and also individuals who are chemically sensitive or have certain health conditions.
So, faced with that opposition, what's the director supposed to do? Just ignore it.
No, not at all. A major part of the director's job is actually engaging with these groups, trying to find common ground, acceptable compromises.
How does that usually work?
Communication is the first step, building trust. Often, the problem is just a lack of understanding on one side or both. If the district can educate people about why the control is necessary and how minimal the risks might be with proper procedures,
Okay.
and conversely, if the director listens and realizes that maybe a small tweak to their operations could significantly reduce a potential negative impact, then you can find a way forward.
You mentioned beekeeping as an example earlier. Can you elaborate on that? How do they work around bees?
Yeah, it's a classic example. Honeybees can be very susceptible to some pesticides used for mosquito control, particularly organophosphates, things like nailed, chlorpyrifos, malathion when used as adulticides.
Adulticides killing the adults.
Right. And also tamephos, which is a larvicide for killing the larva. So to minimize the harm, most aerial spraying for adult mosquitoes is done either really early in the morning before bees are out foraging, or in the evening or at night after they're back in the hive.
Okay, timing helps.
It does. And districts often advise local beekeepers about where spraying activity is likely to happen. So beekeepers can maybe place their hives in lower risk zones.
So they talk to each other.
Ideally, yes. Beekeepers are encouraged to let the district know when they move hives. And if the district knows there are bee yards near a treatment area, they can sometimes adjust, maybe switch from tamephos to a different larvicide like methoprene or bee tie, which are less harmful to bees.
That sounds like a practical solution. What about people who are just generally worried about chemical exposure, even if the science says it's safe at those levels?
That's another common scenario. Many programs actually keep a list of these concerned citizens. These folks often get why mosquito control is needed, but they still have anxiety about the chemicals.
So what do they do for them?
Often the simplest thing is just proactive communication. The district calls these individuals before they spray in their area.
A heads up.
Exactly. It gives those residents a chance to take whatever precautions, make them feel comfortable, stay inside, close windows, whatever, and shows the district is being considerate and trying to work with them.
It really is way more complex than just see mosquito, spray mosquito.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking of more complex, you mentioned earlier that directors get calls about other bugs. Besides mosquitoes, what kinds of things pop up?
All sorts. Yeah, the main job is mosquitoes, but they definitely get calls about other arthropods. A lot relate to things that bite or sting, obviously, but sometimes it's just about critters being a nuisance because there are suddenly so many of them.
Okay, give us some examples of those nuisance ones, the non-biters.
Sure. Blind mosquitoes are a big one. Chironomidae, technically.
Blind mosquitoes.
Yeah, they look a lot like mosquitoes, but the adults don't bite, thank goodness.
Right.
But they can emerge from lakes in these absolutely enormous clouds.
Clouds of bugs. Yikes.
Yeah, makes being outside totally miserable. And the sources say they can even be a traffic hazard if the swarm is dense enough over a road. Trying to control them individually is pointless when there are millions, but the district can sometimes knock down the numbers over a larger area temporarily with adulticides.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Love bugs. Another Florida classic, right?
Love bugs. Cleaning them off the car.
Exactly. They have those peak emergences, April, May, and again in September, where they just swarm roadways. And indoors, sometimes people get infestations of book lice.
Book lice? Are they like actual lice?
No, not true lice. Sosidae, they don't bite or anything, but if you get a lot of them crawling around bookshelves or damp areas, it can be pretty annoying. And sometimes people just have entomophobia, a fear of insects, or even imagine bites or crawling sensations when nothing is there.
Right. Okay, so what about the ones people are legitimately afraid of? The biters and stingers.
Yeah, those definitely generate calls. The sources mention the ones you'd expect.
Yep.
Venomous biters like the black widow spider, though brown recluses are apparently rare in Florida, and certain ticks.
Okay.
And stingers like scorpions, wasps, bees, and especially fire ants. Usually the venom just causes local pain and swelling, but for some people it can trigger a severe allergic reaction, even anaphylactic shock.
That's serious.
Very. Then you've got these things called urticating caterpillars.
Urticating.
Means stinging, like the puss moth caterpillar, which looks fuzzy and cute but packs a nasty sting saddleback caterpillars, Io moth caterpillars. They have these hollow hairs that inject venom if you brush against them. Really painful.
Okay, adding fuzzy caterpillars to my list of things to avoid touching.
Good call. And some insects just shed scales or hairs that can cause allergic reactions, itching, skin rashes in sensitive folks. Plus, of course, the bloodsuckers. Bedbugs, lice, certain flies, mites, ticks. The females often need that blood meal to develop their eggs.
Right. So beyond the venomous ones and the blood feeders, what about the simply irritating biters? The ones that don't inject venom but still make you miserable?
Oh yeah, plenty of those. Things like dog flies, which are actually stable flies, sand flies, horse flies, deer flies, fleas, chiggers, bird mites.
Chiggers.
Tell me about it. They don't inject venom, but their saliva causes that intense itching or can be painful when they bite. Most don't usually spread disease, but they can certainly ruin your day. The sources also mention rare cases of fly larvae actually surviving inside humans.
Wait, what?
Yeah, usually accidental ingestion or something. More common, apparently, is flies or screwworms laying eggs in open wounds or even nostrils. The maggots can cause serious tissue damage if not treated fast.
Okay, that's unpleasant. Let's circle back to diseases. We know mosquitoes carry things like West Nile, Zika, etc. What other arthropods in Florida are disease vectors we should worry about?
Besides mosquitoes, the main concerns in Florida are ticks and fleas.
What?
Endemic typhus from rat fleas used to be a thing, but apparently not so much anymore here.
Okay, so mostly ticks.
Mostly ticks, yeah. They can carry Rocky Mountain spotted fever, although actual cases are rare in Florida, even though the tick that carries it is here. Lyme disease is a big deal elsewhere, but the main ticks for that aren't as common in Florida.
What else from ticks?
There are human ehrlichioses. Those are usually milder, thankfully. And tularemia, or rabbit fever, does happen. But in Florida, people usually get it from handling infected rabbits, not tick bites.
Interesting.
And there have been a few very rare cases of tick paralysis, mostly in kids. But the good news is they recover quickly once you remove the tick.
Okay.
So yeah, it's really important for mosquito control directors to be able to recognize these common pests, the annoying ones, the dangerous ones, and give people good information about them. They often rely on resources like the Florida Insect Control Guide for that.
So they get the calls. Do the districts actually step in and try to control these other arthropods, or do they just give advice?
They often do get involved, yeah. Especially when these non-mosquito insects build up in such large numbers that they become a serious nuisance or even a public health hazard.
So which ones do they typically tackle?
The common ones mentioned are sandflies, dogflies, those blind mosquitoes or midges again, houseflies and other filth flies, and eye gnats.
Okay, let's break those down. Sandflies, those tiny biting things, right? What's the approach there? Sounds tough.
It is tough. Sandflies, or culicoids, are a huge pest, especially near the coast. And honestly, despite a lot of research, there's no perfect control method besides physically changing their breeding habitat.
Like what?
The ideal fix is water management, either flooding the breeding areas completely or filling them in and building barriers like bulkheads. Chemical larvicides exist, but many are toxic to other aquatic life.
Right, non-target effects.
Exactly. There's a safer petroleum solvent called Panisol they can use on shorelines, but you need huge amounts, so it's not practical for large areas. Research on insect growth regulators, IGRs, looks promising for larvicides, though.
What about spraying for the adults? fogging trucks.
They can do that, and it offers temporary relief in populated spots. But the problem is new ones fly in from surrounding areas really quickly, so the effect doesn't last long, and you have to question the cost versus the benefit sometimes.
Yeah, seems like a constant battle.
It often is. So the best advice for individuals right now, stay inside with the AC on when they're bad, and use repellent if you have to be outdoors.
Gotcha. What about the dog flies, the stable flies, especially on the Gulf Coast?
Right. Those are a major headache along the Northwest Gulf Coast, and they can fly pretty far. The state used to chip in some extra funding for control there. Counties in that area really need good inspection and surveillance plans.
To watch for outbreaks.
Yeah, checking the beaches daily for adult flies, especially when the wind is blowing from the north. For the larvae, the focus isn't spraying, it's managing waste plant debris, animal manure, making sure it dries out quickly so the larvae can't develop. Spreading it thinly helps.
Okay, sanitation, basically. And the blind mosquitoes, the midges, the swarming ones.
Yeah, back to those. Non-biting, but a huge nuisance because of the sheer numbers and how they swarm lights. You see them a lot in lake regions or near water bodies that are, frankly, polluted with organic stuff, sewage effluent, runoff with fertilizer, waste from food processing.
So nutrient-rich water is good for them.
Very good for them. They used to use insecticides for the larvae, but now the focus is mostly on controlling the adult swarms to give people temporary relief.
And houseflies. Seems like they're everywhere. Did districts deal with those?
Usually only in really specific, unusual situations, like maybe a badly managed landfill creating a massive fly problem. Because houseflies and other filth flies breed in any warm, moist organic matter, the best control is just good sanitation. Keep things clean, remove breeding sources.
Makes sense.
Plus, houseflies are notorious for developing resistance to insecticides, so you always need to check the latest recommendations for what actually works.
Good point. Okay, last one on that list,
Okay.
ignats. So they're a growing problem.
Yeah, particularly in West Florida, seems linked to converting woodlands to farmland. Like with sandflies, spraying for the adults gives only very temporary relief because new ones emerge and fly in so fast. Again, IGRs for larval control are being researched as maybe a longer-term solution.
It really seems like for many of these nuisance flies, adult spraying is just a temporary Band-Aid.
Often, yeah. Larval control or source reduction is usually the better long-term strategy, but it's not always feasible or easy.
What about general household stuff people call about, like fleas in the carpet or roaches in the kitchen? Do mosquito control districts handle that?
Not typically. That kind of household pest control isn't usually part of their official mission, but providing information is seen as good public relations, so they might offer advice or direct people to the right resources.
Like who?
The sources specifically recommend the Florida Cooperative Extension Service website. They have great up-to-date info on controlling all sorts of household pests.
Good resource to know.
Wow.
Okay, well, this has been incredibly informative, a real deep dive.
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it?
It does. We started with the legal nuts and bolts, Chapter 388, the rules that allow these programs to even exist in Florida.
Right, the authority and the regulations.
Then we really dug into the public relations side, how crucial public support is, how they manage their image, and how they have to deal with inevitable opposition or concerns from groups like beekeepers or just worried citizens.
Building trust and finding compromises, that seemed key.
Definitely. And then the sheer variety of other arthropods they deal with. From nuisance swarms of midges
to genuinely dangerous things like venomous caterpillars or disease-carrying ticks. It's not just mosquitoes by a long shot.
No kidding. And finally, we looked at the actual control methods for some of these other pests, sandflies, dogflies, midges, and importantly, the limitations of those methods. It's often not a simple fix.
Absolutely. It highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Balancing the need to protect public health and comfort against environmental protection, the practical challenges, and what the public thinks and wants.
It's a huge balancing act. Requires science, law, and really good communication skills.
Couldn't have said it better. It's an ongoing effort.
So as you go about your day, maybe consider that unseen world of arthropod management happening right there in your community. Think about all the factors involved, the laws, the biology of these tiny creatures, the environmental impact, public opinion. How much does our awareness, your awareness, actually influence whether these programs succeed? And what does this all make you think about that line between controlling nature and simply coexisting with it? Something to chew on. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Join us next time as we